I wasn't planning to pick up a hitchhiker that night. I never do. But the rain was coming down in thick sheets, and the figures standing by the side of the road looked so pitiful I couldn't just drive by. Their hood was up, head bowed against the storm, and a single, pale hand held out in a plea for help. I pulled over, the wipers struggling to keep the windshield clear. The figure jogged up to the passenger door, drenched and shivering. "Thanks," they said as they climbed in, their voice soft but slightly hoarse. I didn't think anyone was going to stop. Now that they were closer, I could see they were a young woman, maybe late 20s, with sharp cheekbones and dark, damp hair sticking to her face. She tugged the hood back, revealing wide, expressive eyes that didn't quite meet mine. "Where are you headed?" I asked. She hesitated. "Just down the road." "Anywhere? Really? I just need to get out of the rain." I nodded and put the car in drive, the rhythmic thump of the wipers filling the silence. We didn't talk much at first. She kept glancing out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Something about her seemed off. Not dangerous, exactly, but like she was bracing herself for something. "You okay?" I asked after a while. She flinched, then gave a shaky laugh. "Yeah, just a long night." We drove in silence for another few miles before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you believe in fate?" The question caught me off guard. "Fate?" She nodded, still staring out the window. "Like, things happen for a reason. That people cross paths when they're meant to." "I guess so," I said cautiously. "Why?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally turned to look at me, her expression was unreadable. "I think you were supposed to pick me up." My hands tightened on the wheel. Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. "What do you mean?" She opened her mouth to reply, but before she could speak, the headlights caught something in the road up ahead. A figure standing perfectly still in the middle of the lane. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet asphalt. We came to a stop just a few feet from the person, who didn't flinch, didn't move. It was a man, tall, wearing a long coat that flapped in the wind. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were fixed on the car. "What the hell?" I started. But when I looked over at my passenger, she was frozen, her face drained of color. "Keep driving," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What? We can't just—" "Drive!" she shouted, her voice cracking with panic. I didn't need to be told twice. I swerved around the man and hit the gas, my heart pounding. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, perfectly still, his face turned toward us. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice rising. She didn't answer. Her hands were trembling, clutching the seatbelt like a lifeline. "Who was that?" I pressed. She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't think he'd find me this fast." "Who? What are you talking about?" She finally turned to me, her expression a mix of fear and desperation. "I don't have time to explain. Just don't stop the car. No matter what." Before I could respond, the engine sputtered. The car shuddered violently, and the headlights flickered. I swore under my breath, gripping the wheel as the car lurched to a stop. "No," she whispered, her voice filled with dread. "No, no, no." I tried the ignition, but the engine only groaned in protest. The rain pounded against the roof, the wipers stuck halfway across the windshield. And then I saw him. The man from the road was standing in front of the car, illuminated by the dim, flickering headlights. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring. "Lock the doors," she said, her voice shaking. I didn't argue. My hands fumbled with the lock button, and I double-checked to make sure all the doors were secured. "What does he want?" I whispered. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and her face went even paler. "He's not alone." I turned to look. There were more of them now. Figures emerging from the darkness, surrounding the car. Men and women, all wearing the same blank expression, their eyes hollow and lifeless. Panic surged through me. I tried the ignition again, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the key. "Come on," I muttered. "Come on." The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The car jerked forward, plowing through the figures in front of us. They didn't scream, didn't react, just crumpled like paper as the car sped through. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, but my passenger was staring straight ahead, her expression grim. "They'll follow," she said quietly. "Who are they?" I demanded. "They're hunters," she said after a pause. "They take what doesn't belong to this world, and I don't belong here anymore." I didn't know what to say. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving only confusion and fear. "What do you mean, you don't belong?" She looked at me, her expression sad and resigned. "You were supposed to pick me up tonight. That's fate, but I can't let them take you too." Before I could respond, she reached over and yanked the wheel. The car skidded, veering off the road and into the trees. I screamed as we crashed, the world spinning in a blur of rain and shattered glass. When I came to, the passenger seat was empty. She was gone. The figures were gone, too. The only sign she'd ever been there was a single pale handprint on the inside of the windshield. I never told anyone what happened that night, but sometimes, when I'm driving alone, I glance in the rearview mirror and swear I see her sitting in the back seat, watching. I don't mean power outages. Those would have been easier to explain. I mean moments where time just disappeared. I'd be sitting at my desk, working on a report, and then suddenly I'd be on the couch, hours later, with no memory of how I got there. At first, I thought I was overworked. Stress can mess with your head, right? But then it started happening more often, and in stranger ways. One morning, I woke up with mud on my shoes. I didn't even own plants, let alone a garden. The next, there were scratches on my arms, thin, jagged lines like I'd been clawing at something in my sleep. I started locking my doors at night, hoping it would stop whatever was happening. It didn't. Then came the dreams. They were vivid, too vivid. I'd find myself standing in a field of tall, yellow grass under a blood-red sky. There was always a house in the distance, a crumbling, sagging thing with windows like black pits. I never wanted to go near it, but in the dream, my feet always moved on their own, pulling me closer. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, the taste of iron thick in my mouth. At first, I told myself it was just stress or something I ate before bed. But when I woke up one morning with yellow grass stuck to my socks, I stopped pretending it was nothing. I started keeping a journal, trying to piece together the gaps in my memory. Most days were normal, boring even, but there were nights, marked with furious, spidery handwriting I didn't recognize, where the entries made no sense. The house called again. The door is open. I don't want to go in, but I don't have a choice. The shadows move faster now. They're in the walls. They're in me. Don't sleep. Don't go back. I didn't remember writing any of it. And the more I read, the more I noticed a pattern. The blackouts, the dreams, they always came on the same nights, always at the same time. 3:13 a.m. Like clockwork. Desperation drove me to set up a camera. I didn't know what I was expecting. Proof that I was sleepwalking, maybe, or that someone was sneaking into my apartment while I slept. What I saw was worse. The footage started normally. Me, climbing into bed, pulling the covers over my head. Hours passed. Then, at exactly 3:13 a.m., my body sat up, stiff and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. My eyes were open, but they weren't mine. They were dark, empty, like someone had snuffed out the light inside. I watched, horrified, as I got out of bed and walked to the front door. The camera didn't catch where I went after that, but when I came back 2 hours later, my face was streaked with dirt, and I was holding something, a key. I didn't own a key like that. It was old, heavy, with strange symbols carved into the metal. I found it the next morning on the nightstand, right where I'd left it in the video. The symbols seemed familiar, though I couldn't place why. I felt compelled to keep it, even though part of me screamed to throw it away. The next time it happened, I followed myself. I stayed awake until 3:13 a.m., clutching a flashlight, and waited. When the moment came, I felt it, a sudden pull, like something had reached into my chest and tugged. I fought it as long as I could, but then I was moving, my body on autopilot. My hand grabbed the key. My feet carried me to the door, and before I knew it, I was outside. The air was colder than it should have been for spring, biting and sharp. My feet moved through the streets, turning corners I didn't recognize, until I was in a part of town I'd never seen before. The houses here were wrong, dilapidated and dark, as though they'd been abandoned for decades. And then, I saw it. The house from my dreams. It was worse in person. The walls leaned at odd angles, the roof sagging under its own weight. The windows weren't glass. They were holes, yawning black voids that seemed to pulse. The door was ajar, just slightly, and even though every instinct told me to run, I stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of rot and damp wood. The floor creaked under my weight, and the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if the house itself was alive. The key in my hand grew warm, almost burning, and I found myself walking toward a door at the end of the hallway. It opened before I could touch it. The room beyond was empty, except for a mirror. It wasn't mine. It was taller, older, with a tarnished frame that looked like it had been pulled from another century. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't me. It smiled. The thing in the mirror tilted its head, studying me with a mockery of curiosity. Then it lifted a hand, its fingers twitching like it was testing the limits of its own body. My stomach turned as it placed its palm against the glass, and I felt it, a faint, electric pressure, as though it were trying to push through. I ran. I don't remember how I got back home, but when I woke up the next morning, the key was gone, and the scratches on my arms were deeper, rawer, as if I'd been clawing my way out of something. The dreams haven't stopped, but now, the house is closer. I see it from my window, lurking at the edge of my vision. The key is back, too, lying on the kitchen counter every morning no matter how many times I get rid of it. I think the thing in the mirror is still watching me, waiting, and I'm afraid one day, I won't be able to leave the house. I've lived in my house for 10 years. 10 years of creaky floorboards, flickering light bulbs, and a basement I avoided like the plague. It wasn't haunted, not really. It was just old, and old houses are full of noises and drafts and quirks you learn to ignore. But last month, something changed. It started with the pictures. I was dusting the bookshelves when I noticed a photograph on the mantel, a picture of me and my late father at a fishing dock. It wasn't the photo itself that was strange. It was the background. It had shifted. The dock was still there, but the lake was gone. In its place was a field of tall, yellow grass stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The sky was gray, with thick clouds hanging low. I thought I was imagining things. Maybe I just never noticed the background before, I told myself. I went about my day. But later that night, I checked the photo again. The dock was still there. I was still there. But now, there was someone in the grass. A figure standing far in the distance, barely more than a smudge. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, another photo changed. This one was of my sister and me at the zoo, taken when we were kids. We were sitting on a bench with a big, smiling cartoon panda painted on the wall behind us. Except the panda wasn't smiling anymore. Its face was blank, its painted eyes dull and lifeless. I stared at it for so long my head started to ache. By the third day, I couldn't ignore it. Every photo in the house was wrong. In one, my college graduation ceremony, the crowd in the background had disappeared, leaving only empty chairs. In another, a birthday party, the balloons had deflated, their colorful strings tangled and lifeless on the ground. The worst one was my wedding photo. It was just me now. My husband was gone. That night, I locked all the photos in the hall closet and stuffed a blanket under the door. I didn't want to see them anymore. But the feeling of wrongness didn't leave. It crept into the house like a chill, seeping into the walls and floors. The air felt heavier, and I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, certain I wasn't alone. Then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the hum of the fridge or the groan of the water heater. But as the days passed, they grew louder. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded familiar, like a conversation you've overheard but can't place. One night, as I was lying in bed, I realized they were coming from the closet where I'd stashed the photos. I didn't go near it. I couldn't. A week after it all started, I woke up to find the photos back in their frames, hanging on the walls as if I'd never moved them. But they weren't the same. The dock photo now had 3 figures standing in the grass. They were closer, their outlines sharper. The wedding photo was still just me, but now I wasn't smiling. My head was tilted slightly, and my eyes weren't looking at the camera anymore. They were looking at me. I packed a bag and left the house. Stayed at a motel on the edge of town for a couple of nights, trying to clear my head. I told myself I was just overtired, that the stress of work and life was messing with me. I even started to believe it. But on the second night, I opened my bag to grab my toothbrush and froze. The dock photo was in my bag. The 3 figures were gone now. The grass was flattened, as though something had trampled through it, and the gray sky had deepened into near black. I shoved the photo under the mattress and drove home the next morning. When I stepped inside, the house was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that hums in your ears, pressing against your skull. The air was thick, stifling, and the floor felt soft under my feet, like the wood was sagging. I walked to the living room, and my stomach dropped. The photos weren't on the walls anymore. Instead, they were on the floor, arranged in a perfect circle. In the center of the circle was a frame I'd never seen before. It was larger than the others, its glass cracked, the edges warped as though it had been burned. Inside the frame was a photo of me, taken from behind. I was standing in the living room, staring at the circle of photos. My bag was still on my shoulder in the picture, and my keys were in my hand. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The room was empty, but as I stood there, frozen, I felt the floor shift under me, like something was moving beneath it. The whispers returned, louder this time, and they weren't coming from the closet anymore. They were coming from the walls, from the floors, from everywhere. I ran. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't grab my keys. I just ran out the door and kept running until I reached my car. I'm staying with my sister now, several towns over. I haven't told her what happened. I'm not sure I even can. She thinks I'm going through a rough patch, and maybe she's right. Maybe that's all this is. But last night, as I was brushing my teeth, I glanced at the bathroom mirror. There was a smudge in the corner, faint and almost imperceptible. It looked like yellow grass. I was walking to my car after work, and the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the sticky warmth of late summer. That's when I caught it, a faint, sweet aroma that stopped me mid-step. It wasn't flowers or fresh bread or anything familiar. It was richer, almost metallic, and it set off a strange tug in my chest. It was like I was remembering something I'd forgotten. I looked around, trying to locate the source. The parking lot was empty except for the flickering street lamp casting a weak glow over cracked asphalt. My car sat where I left it, but there was something resting on the hood. A jar. It was small, round, and made of dark green glass with no label. A thick, viscous liquid pooled inside, the color shifting between amber and red as it caught the light. I walked up to it, the scent growing stronger, intoxicating, until my head buzzed like I'd had too much wine. I didn't want to touch it, but I did. The jar was heavier than it looked, and its surface was oddly warm, as though it had been left in the sun all day. I turned it over in my hands, searching for some kind of explanation, but there was nothing. No note, no engraving, nothing to explain what it was or why it was on my car. The logical thing would have been to leave it, or throw it away, but instead, I brought it home. The second I set it on my kitchen counter, my cat, Milo, arched his back and hissed, something he never did. He bolted from the room, his tail puffed up like a bottle brush. I stared after him, uneasy. That night, I dreamed of the jar. In the dream, I was in a field. The grass was tall, swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. The sky above was strange, a pale gray-green with clouds that twisted and churned like smoke. I was holding the jar, and its glow illuminated the surrounding grass and flickering amber light. I wasn't alone. In the distance, something moved through the field. I couldn't see it, not clearly, but I could hear the grass rustling, the sound growing closer and closer. My hands tightened around the jar, the liquid inside swirling faster, brighter, until it felt like it was alive. Then the figure burst from the grass. I woke up before I could see what it was. The The jar was the first thing I saw when I opened my eyes. It was still on the kitchen counter where I'd left it, but the liquid inside was different now, darker, almost black, and the scent was stronger, filling my apartment. That was when I noticed the scratches. Fine, delicate lines crisscrossed the lid, faint but deliberate. They hadn't been there before. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the grooves. They formed a symbol, a circle with a jagged line running through it. It looked familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. I decided to get rid of it. I wrapped the jar in a towel, shoved it into a grocery bag, and drove out to the edge of town, where a trail wound through the woods. My plan was to throw it into the river, let the current take it somewhere far away. The whole drive, I felt like I was being watched. The woods were eerily quiet as I walked the trail, the usual hum of cicadas absent. The air felt wrong, heavy, pressing against my skin. By the time I reached the riverbank, my chest was tight, my breath shallow. I threw the jar into the water as hard as I could. For a moment, nothing happened. The jar sank beneath the surface, ripples spreading outward in lazy circles. Then the water began to bubble. It wasn't violent, not at first, just a gentle effervescence, like someone had opened a bottle of soda. But then the bubbles grew larger, darker, until the river churned like boiling oil. The sound was deafening, a low, guttural roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, my heart slamming against my ribs. The bubbling stopped abruptly, leaving the river eerily still. And then it rose. A figure emerged from the water, impossibly tall, its shape shifting and flickering like static on an old TV. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. There were no features, only smooth, shimmering darkness. "You shouldn't have done that," it said. Its voice wasn't a sound so much as a feeling, reverberating through my skull. My vision blurred, the world tilting sideways as I scrambled to my feet. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. It tilted its head further, the motion almost curious. "You brought it back. It's yours now." "I don't want it." The figure didn't respond. It simply sank back into the river, the water swallowing it whole. When I got home, the jar was sitting on my kitchen counter. The scratches on the lid were deeper now, and new lines had appeared, forming a series of runes I didn't recognize. The liquid inside pulsed faintly, its glow casting flickering shadows across the walls. That was 2 weeks ago. The jar won't leave. No matter what I do, bury it, burn it, smash it, it always reappears, sitting on my counter like it never left. The smell has gotten stronger, permeating everything, until it feels like I'm breathing it in with every inhale. And then there are the dreams. Every night, I'm back in the field. The figure in the grass is closer now, its form more distinct. I can see its hands, impossibly long fingers reaching out toward me. The jar glows brighter with every step it takes, the liquid inside swirling faster, darker. I don't know what happens when it reaches me, but I think I'm about to find out. I didn't plan on stopping at the diner. It was one of those roadside places you pass on long drives, the kind that seems frozen in time. The sign buzzed weakly, half the neon letters burned out so it just read "Deer," and the parking lot was nearly empty. But my gas gauge was edging toward empty, and hunger gnawed at my stomach, so I pulled in. The inside was exactly what you'd expect. Cracked vinyl booths, a long counter with faded stools, and a jukebox that looked like it hadn't played anything since the 80s. The smell of grease and coffee hung heavy in the air. A waitress, middle-aged with tired eyes, gave me a quick once-over as I slid into a booth. "What'll it be?" she asked, barely glancing at her notepad. "Coffee," I said. "And a burger, I guess." She nodded and disappeared into the back. I leaned back in the booth, staring at the laminated menu someone had left on the table. It was sticky, smeared with fingerprints. Classic. The place was eerily quiet. There were only a couple of other customers. An old man hunched over a bowl of soup and a young woman at the counter, spinning her straw in a glass of soda. Neither of them looked at me. The waitress returned with my coffee, and I tried to make conversation. "Quiet night." She froze for just a moment, like I'd asked something deeply personal. Then she shrugged. "Always is." Her answer felt loaded, but before I could say anything, she was gone again. As I stirred cream into my coffee, I noticed something odd. The spoon made the faintest noise against the cup, but it echoed strangely, too loud, too long, like the sound was stretching out and lingering in the air. I set the spoon down, unease settling in my stomach, and glanced around the diner. The old man was still hunched over his soup, but he wasn't eating. His spoon hovered just above the bowl, perfectly still, as if he'd forgotten what he was doing. The woman at the counter had stopped twirling her straw, her hand frozen mid-motion. Her eyes were fixed on something I couldn't see, staring just past me. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Neither of them moved. The sound of the jukebox clicking startled me, even though it didn't play anything. It just clicked once, like it was getting ready to start. But no music came. I turned back to the window, hoping to ground myself, but the parking lot outside was gone. Not empty, gone. Where there had been asphalt and flickering lights, there was now nothing. Just a black void stretching out infinitely, like someone had painted over the world. I stood up, panic bubbling in my chest, and rushed to the door. The handle was cold, unnaturally so, but when I pulled it, the door wouldn't budge. "Can I help you?" The waitress's voice made me spin around. She was standing behind the counter now, her face oddly blank. The lines of exhaustion were gone, replaced by something smooth and unnatural, like her skin had been stretched too tight. Her eyes were wrong too, too shiny, too still. I started, but my words faltered. "I need to go." Her lips stretched into a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "You just got here." The others were watching me now. The old man had finally moved, his head slowly turning toward me, his soup forgotten. His eyes were glassy, almost reflective. The young woman at the counter did the same. Her neck tilting too far, her movements jerky, as if she were a puppet on strings. The diner felt wrong, like it wasn't really there, like the walls and floors were thin and barely holding back something I couldn't understand. I backed away, bumping into a booth, and the waitress tilted her head, her smile widening. "You haven't tried your burger," she said. I looked at the table and froze. The plate had appeared while I wasn't looking. On it sat a burger, but it wasn't right. The patty was raw, oozing red juices onto the plate, and the bun was slightly off color, grayish, like it had been sitting out too long. But the worst part was the smell. It wasn't the smell of food. It was something sour, metallic, like blood and decay. "I'm not hungry," I managed to choke out. Her smile didn't waver. "You should eat." The old man and the young woman both stood now, moving in unison, their heads tilting at the same impossible angle. Their eyes glinted in the dim light, and their mouths opened slightly, as if they were trying to speak but couldn't remember how. I turned back to the door and slammed into it with all my strength. The glass didn't even rattle. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and frantic, but even it looked wrong. The edges of my face seemed to blur and ripple, like I wasn't really there either. "Let me out," I shouted, my voice echoing in the oppressive silence. The waitress laughed, a low, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. "Out," she repeated, "but you haven't even finished your stay." The lights flickered, and when they came back on, everything had shifted. The tables were gone, replaced by endless rows of booths that stretched into the darkness. The counter was now impossibly long, disappearing into the void, and the walls were closing in, warping and twisting like they were alive. The waitress stepped closer, her face melting into something featureless and blank. "You'll get used to it," she said, her voice distorted now, deeper and layered, as if multiple people were speaking through her. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. When I looked up, the other customers were no longer people. They were shapes now, shadows with faint, flickering outlines, their glassy eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They surrounded me, inching closer. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the waitress's voice, soft and distant. "Welcome to the diner. You're going to be here for a long time." When I woke up, I was sitting in one of the booths, staring at a menu I couldn't read. The words shifted and blurred, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of them. The diner was quiet again, the lights dim and flickering. The waitress was back behind the counter, her face now completely blank, like a mannequin's. I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Weeks? Time doesn't feel real anymore. The others, the shadows, don't move much, but I can feel them watching me, waiting for something. And the worst part? The door is gone. I'm starting to forget what the world outside looked like. Sometimes, I wonder if it ever really existed at all. I moved into the new house on a Thursday, lured by the cheap rent and the quiet neighborhood. It was the kind of place that felt too good to be true. A quaint two-story house with a wraparound porch, hardwood floors, and a sprawling backyard. The landlord seemed eager to hand me the keys, barely stopping to give me a tour before rushing off. "Enjoy it," she'd said, almost too quickly. "You're getting a deal." The first few days were blissfully uneventful. I unpacked, arranged my furniture, and explored the house's quirks. The creaky stairs, the tiny attic door I couldn't quite open, the faint hum of the old heating system, all charming in their way. It wasn't until the fourth night that I noticed something strange. I was brushing my teeth when I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate creaks that traveled across the floorboards above me. My heart froze. I lived alone. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a ceramic lamp, and crept up the stairs, my pulse hammering in my ears. The upstairs hallway was empty. The doors to the two bedrooms and the bathroom were shut, just as I'd left them. I checked each room, but there was no one there. I told myself it was just the house settling, a sound I'd never noticed before, and went back downstairs. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I discovered the first note. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, written on a piece of yellowed paper in jagged, uneven handwriting. "You've moved it. Put it back." I stared at it, trying to make sense of the message. I hadn't moved anything. I spent the rest of the day convincing myself it was a prank. Maybe the landlord had left it as some weird joke. But by evening, the thought of the note wouldn't leave my mind. That night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they started in the attic. I lay in bed, clutching my phone, listening as they moved across the ceiling, down the stairs, and stopped just outside my bedroom door. My breath caught. I waited, heart pounding, but nothing happened. The silence was worse than the sound. In the morning, there was another note, left on my nightstand. "You've moved it. Put it back." I couldn't take it anymore. I called the landlord and demanded answers. She hesitated for a long moment before finally saying, "It's just an old house. You're hearing things. There's nothing to worry about." "Did you leave notes here?" I pressed. She laughed nervously. "Of course not." That night, I decided to check the attic. I didn't want to, but something about the notes felt urgent, almost like a warning. It took me half an hour to pry the tiny attic door open. The smell of dust and something faintly metallic wafted down as I climbed the ladder. The attic was smaller than I'd expected, more of a crawl space than a proper room. The only light came from a small, grimy window. And there, in the middle of the floor, was a single object, an old wooden box. It looked like a jewelry box, its surface scratched and worn. My first instinct was to leave it alone, but something compelled me to pick it up. It was lighter than I expected, as if it were hollow. When I opened it, there was nothing inside except for a slip of paper. Too late. Behind me, I heard the attic door slam shut. I scrambled down the ladder, pulling at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the house itself were alive and breathing. I could hear the footsteps again, this time pounding up the stairs, faster and louder. I turned back toward the attic window, thinking I could break it and climb out, but I froze. There was a face staring at me, pale, gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. It was pressed against the glass, its lips curling into a wide, unnatural smile. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in. The last thing I remember is the sound of something heavy crashing behind me. I woke up on the floor of the living room, the box clutched in my hands. The attic door was wide open, the ladder neatly tucked away as if nothing had happened. I stumbled to my feet, disoriented, and realized something else was missing. All the furniture I'd unpacked, the couch, the chairs, the table, was gone. The house was empty. Except for one thing, a single note on the floor. You moved it. You shouldn't have. I left the house that day and never went back. The landlord never answered my calls, and when I drove by a week later, the house was dark, the windows boarded up. I heard from a neighbor that the place had been vacant for years, that no one ever stayed more than a few days. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear footsteps outside my apartment, and when I check my counter, I find notes waiting for me. You moved it. You shouldn't have. I don't know what I moved. I don't know what it wants, but I can feel it getting closer. It was the rain that started it. The kind of rain that makes everything feel heavy, slow, like the world is sinking into itself. I had just stepped out of the coffee shop, umbrella in hand, when I noticed something strange. A man was standing at the corner of the street, holding a red umbrella. At first, he looked normal enough, tall, well-dressed, his coat buttoned up neatly against the weather. But his umbrella wasn't wet. Not a drop of water clung to it, even though the rain was coming down in thick sheets. I stopped mid-step, staring. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. I brushed it off and kept walking. People are weird, I told myself. But the man with the red umbrella wasn't the only strange thing I noticed that day. A few blocks later, I passed a parked car with its windshield wipers going at full speed. Nothing unusual about that, except the car was empty, not just unoccupied, but completely empty. No seats, no steering wheel, nothing. Just a hollow metal shell with wipers moving back and forth, as if trying to clean glass that wasn't there. I hurried home, my chest tight, the rain soaking my shoes. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt ridiculous. It was just one of those days, I thought. A weird day. Everyone has them. I kicked off my wet shoes, tossed the umbrella in the corner, and sat down on the couch to decompress. That's when I saw it. The picture frame on my coffee table wasn't mine. It was the same silver frame I'd had for years, but the photo inside was different. It was supposed to be a picture of me and my sister at the beach, her arms slung over my shoulder, both of us grinning like idiots. Instead, the photo showed me standing alone in a park I didn't recognize, staring at the camera with a blank expression. The background was blurred, as though the photo had been taken in motion. I picked up the frame, my fingers trembling. I didn't own this photo. I had never been to that park. And yet, there I was, in crisp, undeniable detail. I tore the back off the frame and found my original photo still tucked behind the strange one, hidden like it was waiting to be discovered. I didn't know what to do, so I put the frame back on the table and turned on the TV, hoping to drown out the uneasy silence that had settled over my apartment. The channels were all wrong. Every station showed the same thing, a live feed of an empty street. The rain was pouring down, and in the distance, under a street lamp, stood a figure holding a red umbrella. My chest tightened. The man didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't seem to notice the camera at all. I turned the TV off and sat there in the silence, my heart pounding. Something was wrong. I didn't know how or why, but I could feel it. The air in my apartment felt heavier, charged, like a thunderstorm was brewing just beneath the surface of reality. The next day, the glitches started. At first, they were small. My keys weren't where I'd left them. My phone buzzed with a notification that disappeared the moment I tried to check it. The clock on my microwave ran backward for an hour, then stopped entirely. I tried to convince myself it was stress, lack of sleep, anything rational. But then the bigger things happened. I walked into my bedroom one evening and found a second door on the far wall. It wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't even live in a large apartment, just a small one-bedroom with no frills. But there it was, a plain wooden door with a tarnished brass knob, standing where my bookshelf used to be. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door. It didn't belong. I knew that. And yet, it felt like it had always been there. Like I was the one who didn't belong. My hand moved toward the knob almost on its own, fingers brushing the cold metal. A knock came from the other side. I yanked my hand back, stumbling over the edge of the bed. The knock came again, sharp and deliberate. 3 loud, steady raps. My throat was dry, my mind racing. Who could it be? Where did the door lead? I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. Finally, I found my voice. "Who's there?" I croaked. There was no answer. I backed out of the room, slamming the original door shut behind me. That night, I slept on the couch, or at least, I tried to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the red umbrella, the hollow car, the unfamiliar door. When I finally mustered the courage to check the bedroom the next morning, the second door was gone. In its place, the bookshelf had returned, undisturbed, the books arranged exactly as I'd left them. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing, but then I saw the wet footprints on the floor. They weren't mine. I started noticing the man with the red umbrella everywhere after that. On the subway platform, standing perfectly still as trains rushed past. In a reflection in the shop window as I walked by. Once, standing at the end of my street, looking up at my apartment building. He was always at a distance, always silent, but always watching. The glitches in my apartment grew worse. The water in my taps ran hot no matter how long I let it flow. My reflection in the bathroom mirror lagged a second behind my movements. The photo in the frame on my coffee table changed daily. Always me, always somewhere unfamiliar, always alone. And then, one night, the door came back. This time, it wasn't in my bedroom. It was in the living room, where the coat rack used to stand. The air around it felt colder, sharper, like stepping into the mouth of a cave. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to acknowledge it, but the knock came again. 3 sharp raps, steady and patient. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the door, until I realized something that made my blood run cold. The knocking wasn't coming from the other side. It was coming from inside. The door rattled, just slightly, as though something behind it was testing the handle. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the door was gone. Now, I see the man with the red umbrella even when I close my eyes. His silhouette is burned into the back of my mind. Always there, always waiting. I don't know what he wants. I don't know why the glitches keep happening, why the world feels wrong. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever's on the other side of that door is trying to get through. And sooner or later, it will. It all started when I borrowed a book from the tiny, hole-in-the-wall used bookstore down the street. I hadn't been looking for anything specific, just something to kill a lazy Sunday afternoon. The shop owner, an older man with glasses too big for his face, handed it to me with a peculiar look, like he was both amused and a little worried. The book had no title on the cover, just a deep, reddish leather binding that felt warm under my fingers. Inside, the pages were brittle and yellowed, and the text was written in a language I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was Latin, but the script seemed to shift every time I glanced away, the letters writhing like they were alive. "People say that one's cursed," the shop owner said with a chuckle, as if he didn't quite believe it himself. I should have walked away, but I didn't. The first odd thing happened that night. I was flipping through the book, tracing my fingers over the strange, twisting letters, when one of them moved. I froze, staring as the tiny symbol slithered across the page like an insect. My stomach churned, but I told myself I was tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then it happened again, and again. I slammed the book shut and shoved it under a pile of magazines on my coffee table, determined to forget about it. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The dream started that night. In the first dream, I was standing in a vast, empty library. The shelves stretched endlessly in every direction, their surfaces crammed with books of all shapes and sizes. The air was heavy with the smell of old paper and ink, and the only sound was the faint rustle of turning pages. Then I noticed the figures. They were shadowy, barely there, flitting between the shelves like moths around a flame. They didn't have faces, but I could feel their attention, sharp and probing. One of them stopped and turned toward me, its head tilting like it was trying to understand what it was seeing. When I woke up, the book was on my nightstand. I hadn't put it there. Over the next few days, things escalated. Words from the book began appearing in strange places, scrawled on the bathroom mirror in steam, spelled out in spilled coffee grounds, even carved into the wood of my desk at work. Always the same phrase, one I didn't understand but could hear in my head when I read it: "It opens for you." I tried returning the book to the shop, but when I got there, the store was gone. Just an empty storefront with dusty windows and a for lease sign. By then, the dreams had started bleeding into reality. I'd be standing in my kitchen or sitting at my desk, and suddenly, I'd feel the heavy, oppressive silence of the library pressing down on me. The air would grow cold, and I'd see movement out of the corner of my eye. Those shadowy figures watching, waiting. One night, I woke up to find the book open on my chest. The pages were glowing faintly, the letters shifting and rearranging themselves into a new pattern. My hands moved on their own, tracing the symbols, and as I did, a word formed on my lips. Enter. The room went black. When I opened my eyes, I was in the library. But this time, it wasn't empty. The shadowy figures were everywhere, surrounding me, their forms more solid now. I could see the jagged edges of their shapes, like shards of broken glass. They whispered in a language I couldn't understand, but the meaning seeped into my mind like ink spreading through water. You brought it. You opened it. Now it opens you. I tried to run, but the shelves shifted around me, closing in, trapping me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a roar in my ears. And then I saw it. At the far end of the library, where the shelves parted, stood a door. It was massive, made of dark, ancient wood, and carved with the same writhing symbols from the book. It pulsed faintly, like it was alive. The figures parted, creating a path, and I felt myself drawn toward the door. My legs moved without my consent, each step heavier than the last. When I reached it, the whispers fell silent. The door opened. I can't describe what I saw on the other side. Not because I don't remember, but because there aren't words for it. It was vast and endless and wrong, and the sight of it felt like it was unraveling me from the inside out. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, the book still on my nightstand. But the words inside were gone, the pages blank except for a single phrase scrawled in the center of the last page. You are the key now. That was weeks ago. I haven't slept since. Not really. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers, feel the pull of the library. The book is gone now, but I don't think it matters. The door is open, and whatever's on the other side is waiting. I can feel it, and I think it's getting closer. At first, I thought it was coming from outside. Maybe a neighbor playing music with the bass turned up too high or some distant machinery. But it wasn't a noise, exactly. It was more like a vibration, faint but persistent, as if the air itself was alive with sound. I felt it most strongly at night, lying in bed when the world was quiet. It would settle into my chest like a second heartbeat, low and rhythmic. No matter how much I tried to block it out, earplugs, white noise, even sleeping pills, it was always there. And worse, it was getting louder. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I sat up in bed, my sheets twisted around me, and listened. This time, the hum wasn't just a vibration. It was a melody, faint and haunting, like a song half remembered from a dream. I couldn't make out the tune, but it felt familiar, like I should know it. I spent hours wandering through my apartment, trying to pinpoint the source. I turned off the power, checked the pipes, even pressed my ear against the walls. Nothing. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, like it was coming from inside me. The next day, I asked my neighbors if they'd noticed anything strange. Most of them gave me the same polite but distant look, the kind that says, "Leave me alone." But one man, an older guy named Bill who lived a few doors down, hesitated. "You hear it too?" he asked, his voice low. I froze. "You mean the humming?" Bill nodded, his eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. "Yeah, started a couple weeks ago. Thought I was losing it. Do you know what it is?" I asked. He shook his head. "But it's not just noise. It pulls you, doesn't it? Like it's trying to lead you somewhere." That sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't admitted it to myself, but he was right. The sound didn't just fill the air. It felt purposeful, like it wanted me to follow it. Before I could ask more, Bill shut his door. "Be careful," he said through the crack. "It doesn't stop once it starts." That night, the hum grew louder. The melody was clearer now, an eerie, looping tune that seemed to echo through my skull. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was pressure. The air felt heavier, and my chest ached as if the song were pressing against my ribs, trying to escape. And then came the dreams. In the first one, I was walking down a narrow corridor made of smooth, gray stone. The walls seemed to pulse in time with the hum, and the light, dim and flickering, came from no source I could see. At the end of the corridor was a door, tall and black, with intricate carvings that seemed to shift when I looked at them. When I reached for the handle, I woke up. The second dream was worse. This time, I was standing in a vast, empty room, the floor covered in a thin layer of water that reflected the sky above. There was no ceiling, just an expanse of swirling gray clouds. In the distance, a figure was standing with its back to me, its head tilted as if listening. The hum was deafening now, the melody looping faster and faster, and the figure turned to face me. I couldn't see its face, just a blur of darkness, but its mouth opened, and the melody poured out like a physical thing, wrapping around me and pulling me under. I woke up gasping, the sound of the hum still ringing in my ears. After that, I stopped sleeping. I couldn't risk it. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the corridor, the door, the figure waiting for me. But the lack of sleep didn't help. The hum was louder than ever, invading my waking hours, distorting the edges of my reality. Lights flickered when I walked into a room. Shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking. And worst of all, I wasn't alone. At first, it was just glimpses, shapes at the edge of my vision, gone when I turned to look, but they grew bolder. One night, as I sat in my living room with every light on, I felt it. A presence, cold and heavy, standing just behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. But in the reflection of the TV screen, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its head tilted just like the one in my dream. It didn't have a face, not exactly, but the darkness where its features should have been rippled, like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. It didn't move. It just watched, and though it made no sound, I could feel the hum radiating from it, vibrating through my teeth, my bones. And then it was gone. The next day, I found a note on my kitchen table. I hadn't written it. The handwriting was sharp and angular, the ink a deep, wet black that seemed to shimmer in the light. The door opened soon. Are you ready? I wasn't. The hum became unbearable after that. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was inside me, shaking me apart. I couldn't eat, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but follow it. It led me out of my apartment, down streets I didn't recognize, through alleys that seemed too narrow to exist. And then I saw it. The door. It was exactly as I'd seen it in my dreams, tall and black, with carvings that twisted and writhed like living things. The hum was deafening now, the melody looping so fast it felt like it would split my skull. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the handle. The door swung open. I can't tell you what was on the other side. I don't have the words for it. Light and darkness and sound all folded into each other. Impossibly vast and impossibly close. Shapes moved in the distance, or maybe they were in my mind. The hum wasn't a sound anymore. It was everything, a force so overwhelming that it erased me, piece by piece, until I was nothing but vibration, a single note in the infinite melody. And now I'm back, but the hum hasn't stopped. It's louder than ever, and I think I'm the one making it now. I never liked mirrors. Something about them always felt off, like they captured more than just reflections. But what happened last Tuesday made me swear them off entirely. It started with a full-length mirror I found at a flea market. I wasn't even looking for one, but there it was, leaning precariously against a pile of mismatched furniture. Its frame was intricate, wrought iron shaped into twisting vines and leaves, with a patina that gave it an ancient look. The vendor said it was handmade, as steel, at $50. I wasn't in the market for home decor, but something about it called to me. After hauling it home and propping it up in my bedroom, I felt a strange unease. It was subtle at first, like the sensation of being watched, but I brushed it off as overactive imagination. I hung some fairy lights around the frame to soften its imposing vibe, and it almost looked cozy. Almost. The first odd thing happened that night. As I was getting ready for bed, I caught movement in the mirror. Not my movement, something else, behind me. It was quick, a flicker in the corner of the glass. I spun around, but nothing was there. The room was still, silent except for the faint hum of the street lamp outside my window. I told myself it was just a trick of the light and went to bed. The next morning, the mirror seemed normal. My reflection stared back at me, tired and bleary-eyed, as I brushed my teeth. But when I reached to grab my toothbrush off the counter, I noticed something strange. The reflection moved out of sync. It was slight, just a fraction of a second, but enough to make my skin crawl. I waved my hand slowly, watching as my reflection hesitated, then caught up. I stared into the glass, and for a moment, I could have sworn my reflection wasn't looking at me. It was looking past me. By the third day, I was actively avoiding the mirror. I kept it covered with a sheet most of the time, but curiosity got the better of me that evening. I pulled the sheet off and stood in front of it, daring it to do something. For a long time, nothing happened. My reflection mimicked my movements perfectly. I was just about to let out a nervous laugh when I noticed something horrifying. The room in the mirror wasn't my room. It was close, almost identical, but there were subtle differences. The books on my shelf were in the wrong order. The curtains were a darker shade, and the reflection of the clock on my wall showed a different time, 3:17, though it was barely 10 p.m. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. My reflection leaned closer too, but its movements were wrong. Stiff, forced, like it wasn't mirroring me so much as acting out a role. "What are you?" I whispered. The reflection smiled. I didn't. I stumbled back, heart hammering, and threw the sheet over the mirror again. That night, I slept with the lights on and the mirror shoved into the corner of the room, facing the wall. The next day, I decided to get rid of it. I dragged it down to the curb and left it with a sign that said, "Free." But when I came back inside, it was there, in my bedroom, leaning against the wall like I'd never moved it. Panic set in. I tried breaking it, but the glass wouldn't shatter. I swung a hammer as hard as I could, but it bounced off like the mirror was made of steel. Desperate, I called the flea market vendor, but the number he'd given me was disconnected. It was like the mirror had never come from anywhere at all. That night, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like distant voices bleeding through a thin wall. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. As the hours dragged on, the whispers grew louder, overlapping, until they filled the room with an unintelligible cacophony. I sat on my bed, clutching my knees to my chest, when the sheet covering the mirror started to move. It fluttered gently at first, then began to writhe, as if something underneath was pushing against it. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispers stopped all at once, replaced by a deep, guttural voice. "Let me out." The sheet slipped off, revealing the mirror, but the reflection wasn't mine anymore. The glass showed a dark, endless void, and from its depths, a figure emerged. It looked like me, almost, but its eyes were empty, black pits, and its smile stretched too wide, too sharp. "Let me out," it repeated, reaching a hand toward the glass. Its fingers pressed against the inside of the mirror, the glass rippling like water. I screamed and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I spent the night huddled on my couch, every light in the apartment blazing. When dawn finally came, I ventured back into the bedroom. The mirror was gone. For weeks, I tried to convince myself it was over. I got rid of every mirror in my apartment, just in case. But the unease never left. Every shadow felt too long. Every reflective surface seemed to hum faintly when I walked by. And then, one morning, I found it again. The mirror was leaning against my living room wall, pristine as ever. The iron frame gleamed in the sunlight, and my reflection stared back at me, perfectly normal, except it blinked, and I didn't. Personal assistant needed. Discretion required. $5,000 per week. It sounded too good to be true, but I was desperate. Bills were piling up, and I couldn't pass up that kind of money. The listing was vague, promising unique tasks and exciting opportunities. I figured it was some eccentric millionaire looking for someone to manage their weird hobbies. Boy, was I wrong. I applied on a whim and got a call the same day. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, belonging to a woman named Ms. Raven. She asked a few standard questions before saying, "If you're interested, meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. 7. Mercer Lane. Bring nothing but yourself." That's it. No resume, no references, just me. It was strange, but $5,000 a week was worth a little weirdness. The next morning, I arrived at the address. A towering black building in the heart of the city, wedged between two derelict warehouses. The windows were tinted so dark they reflected the overcast sky, and the entrance was a single heavy door with no visible handle. Before I could knock, it swung open. A tall, pale woman stood in the doorway. Her hair was jet black and sleek, her suit perfectly tailored. "You're punctual," she said with a thin smile. "That's good. Come in." The interior of the building was as cold and sterile as a museum. Polished black floors, gray walls, and no decoration except for a massive clock that ticked loudly in the entryway. Ms. Raven didn't waste time. She led me down a long corridor and into a small, windowless office. "This is a contract job," she began, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk. "You'll complete one task per day, no questions asked. At the end of the week, you'll be paid in full. Fail to complete a task, and our agreement ends immediately. Understood?" "Sure," I said, scanning the paper. The contract was simple: do the tasks, get paid. I hesitated only for a second before signing. What's the worst it could be? Picking up dry cleaning? Feeding an exotic pet? I could handle it. Day one's task was already waiting for me in a sealed envelope. Ms. Raven handed it to me with that same thin smile and said, "Remember, no questions?" Inside was a single sentence: "Stand on the corner of 5th and Main at 3:33 p.m. Do not move until 3:37 p.m. Weird, but easy enough. At 3:30, I was there, standing awkwardly on the sidewalk. People passed by without a second glance, and I started to feel ridiculous. Then, at 3:33 exactly, I felt it. The air changed. It wasn't colder or warmer, just heavier, like stepping into a dense fog. The street noises dulled, and everything seemed off. A man in a dark coat brushed past me, his face partially obscured by a hat. He didn't look at me, but he muttered something under his breath, a string of words that sounded like gibberish. My skin prickled. At 3:37, the air returned to normal, the noise of the city flooding back in an instant. The man was gone. I left quickly, feeling more unsettled than I wanted to admit. When I returned to the building, Ms. Raven was waiting. "Well done," she said, handing me an envelope. Inside was $1,000 in crisp bills. "Tomorrow's instructions will arrive at your residence." The next day, a plain white envelope was slipped under my door. This time, the task was more bizarre. Leave a red umbrella on the third bench in Greenfield Park at exactly 4:17 p.m. Do not look back. I found an old red umbrella at a thrift store and headed to the park. At 4:17, I placed the umbrella on the bench and started to walk away. But curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced over my shoulder. A man in a gray suit was sitting on the bench, holding the umbrella. He hadn't been there seconds ago. He looked straight at me, his eyes impossibly black, like twin voids. I stumbled, my stomach flipping, and turned back toward my car. I didn't look back again. Each day, the tasks grew stranger. On Wednesday, I had to slide a blank envelope into a crack in a brick wall downtown. On Thursday, I spent 2 hours sitting in an abandoned cafe, staring at an empty table as if waiting for someone. By Friday, I was exhausted and unnerved, but I needed the money. That day's task arrived in a black envelope. The instructions read, "Be at the rooftop of 12 Bayview Tower at 11:57 p.m. Await further instruction." Bayview Tower was abandoned, a half-finished skyscraper that loomed over the city like a jagged tooth. Getting to the rooftop meant climbing a dozen flights of stairs in near darkness. By the time I reached the top, my legs were jelly and my lungs burned. The rooftop was empty except for Ms. Raven. She stood near the edge, her silhouette sharp against the night sky. "You've done well," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. "One last task remains." She handed me a small black box. "Take this to the man standing at the corner of Pine and Ash. Do not speak to him. Do not open the box." I nodded, gripping the box tightly. When I turned to leave, she added, "And whatever you do, don't stop walking." I found the man easily. He stood perfectly still under a flickering streetlight, his face obscured by shadow. I approached cautiously, holding out the box. He took it without a word, and for a moment, I thought it was over. Then he spoke. "Do you want to know what's inside?" The question stopped me in my tracks. Against every instinct, I turned to face him. He wasn't a man. His face was featureless, smooth like polished stone, and where his eyes should have been, there were only deep, swirling voids. His mouth didn't move, but I heard his voice in my head. "You shouldn't have stopped." The world tilted, and everything went black. I woke up in my apartment, the sun streaming through the window. My phone buzzed with a notification. A deposit of $5,000. No note, no explanation. I quit the job, blocked the number. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I see the black box in the corner of my vision. And I know, deep down, it's waiting for me to pick it up. I noticed the first glitch in my life on a Tuesday. I was walking home from work, earbuds in, zoning out to a podcast I couldn't remember the name of. The sky was overcast, a deep gray that matched my mood. I passed the corner bodega, like I always did, and waved at the owner, Manny. He waved back, same warm smile as ever. But when I reached the next block, something made me stop. I turned around. The bodega wasn't there. I stared at the corner, confused. The building was still there. Same dimensions, same brick exterior. But instead of Manny's brightly lit storefront, it was boarded up. Faded posters covered the wood, peeling and weather-beaten, as if no one had touched them in years. I backed up a step, blinking hard. Maybe I'd taken a different route? My brain offered excuses, fatigue, stress, a weird mental slip. But deep down, I knew. I walked this route every single day. When I got home, I almost convinced myself to let it go. Weird things happen. Brains are faulty machines. But that night, I had a dream. I was standing outside the bodega, staring at the boarded-up windows. The street was eerily quiet. No cars, no people, just the soft sound of wind. I turned, and there was Manny, standing across the street, watching me. He didn't smile. When I woke up, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been real. The next day, I tried to find the bodega again, determined to prove it was still there. I retraced my steps, but the corner was empty, just the same boarded-up facade. I even asked a passerby if they remembered the shop. "The what?" they asked, their brow furrowing. There's never been a bodega there. By the time I got home, my anxiety had bloomed into a full-blown obsession. I searched online for any trace of Manny's bodega. Yelp reviews, Google Maps photos, anything. But it was gone, like it had never existed. I found other things missing after that. Small things at first. A framed photo on my bookshelf that I didn't remember taking, a mug with a chipped handle that I always used for coffee. My Spotify playlist began deleting songs I was sure I'd added. My wardrobe felt emptier, like a few shirts and jackets had vanished without explanation. And then people started changing. At work, my coworker Danielle was suddenly left-handed. I didn't notice until she signed her name on a form, the pen awkwardly smudging the paper. "Since when are you a lefty?" I asked, trying to keep it casual. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Since forever?" I laughed it off, but the pit in my stomach grew. The next day, my boss called me by the wrong name. "Alex," she said, handing me a stack of papers. "Alex?" I repeated. "Yeah," she replied, her tone impatient. "Did you forget your own name or something?" I wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes told me she was serious. The entire office seemed to think my name was Alex. Even my email signature had changed. That night, I tore through my apartment, searching for something, anything, to prove my reality hadn't gone completely sideways. But every drawer, every photo album, every online account betrayed me. My name was Alex. My reflection in the mirror mouthed the word back at me, its expression cold and detached. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the bodega. Manny was always there, standing in the same spot, watching me. Each night, he was a little closer. The final straw came when I woke up to find my apartment wasn't mine anymore. The layout was the same, but the furniture was different. The walls were painted a color I'd never seen before, a dull beige that made my skin crawl. My bookshelves were gone, replaced by a cabinet full of porcelain figurines I didn't recognize. I tried calling someone, anyone, but my phone was blank. No contacts, no call history, no messages. It was like I'd been dropped into a life that wasn't mine. The only thing that felt familiar was a single object sitting on the kitchen counter. A small, crumpled receipt from Manny's bodega. I picked it up with trembling hands. The date on it was smudged, but the words were clear: "Thank you, come again." I knew what I had to do. I went back to the boarded-up corner, standing there in the cold night air. The street was empty again, just like in my dreams. I hesitated, heart pounding, before reaching out to knock on the wood. To my surprise, the door creaked open. The inside of the bodega was exactly as I remembered. The cluttered shelves, the humming fridge, the faint smell of ripe bananas. And there was Manny, standing behind the counter, his face obscured by the dim light. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice heavy with something that felt like sorrow. "What's happening to me?" I asked, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. Instead, he placed something on the counter, a mirror. When I looked into it, I didn't see myself. I saw her, the version of me that wasn't me, the one who lived in the apartment with the beige walls and the porcelain figurines. Her eyes met mine, and she smiled faintly, like she'd been expecting this. "She's waiting," Manny said. "It's her turn now." I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't move. The reflection in the mirror tilted its head, her smile widening as she reached forward. And then she stepped through. I woke up in her life. The walls are beige now. The furniture is hers. The people around me call me Alex, and I've stopped correcting them. It doesn't matter anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the bodega. Manny is still there, still watching. And in the mirror, I see her smiling back at me. The train station was deserted when I arrived, its iron benches gleaming faintly under the flickering overhead lights. My breath formed little clouds in the chilly air, and the only sound was the distant hum of the tracks, like a heartbeat buried beneath the earth. I checked my watch. 11:49 p.m. The train wasn't due for another 10 minutes. I didn't even know where it was headed. I just needed to leave. Anywhere. I sat on the cold bench, the weight of the night pressing down on me. The events of the day blurred together in my mind. The argument with my boss, the half-empty apartment waiting for me, the suffocating sense that life was folding in on itself. The thought had struck me like lightning hours earlier. Get on the next train. Don't think. Just go. The station had an old-time charm, its arched ceilings and ornate tiles relics from a forgotten era, but something about it felt off. The air had a strange stillness, like the moment before a storm, and the shadows stretched just a little too far. I heard the train before I saw it, the low rumble growing louder as headlights pierced the dark tunnel. The sound wasn't quite right, more metallic grinding than the smooth glide I'd expected. When it emerged, the train looked ancient, its black and silver exterior gleaming like polished armor. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, but the light from the platform reflected off them, making it seem like the train itself was watching me. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing an empty car. No conductor, no passengers, just rows of seats upholstered in crimson velvet. The air inside smelled faintly of leather and something sweeter. Candied oranges, maybe? I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to turn back, but the pull was stronger. Without a second thought, I stepped aboard. The doors closed behind me with a finality that made my stomach drop. The train lurched forward, smoother than I'd anticipated, and the station disappeared into the shadows. I chose a seat near the middle, the velvet plush beneath me. The train moved faster than any I'd been on before, the scenery outside blurring into streaks of color. But when I looked closer, it wasn't the city or countryside rushing past. It was moments, flashes of people's lives, like old film reels spliced together. A child laughing as she jumped into a pile of leaves. An old man crying silently at a funeral. A woman standing on the edge of a cliff, the ocean roaring beneath her. I blinked, unsure if I was imagining it, but the images kept coming, faster and faster. None of them were mine, yet they felt familiar, like I'd seen them in a dream. Not what you were expecting, is it? The voice startled me. I turned to see a man sitting across the aisle. I hadn't noticed him when I boarded, but there he was, dressed in a sharp gray suit that looked slightly too big for him. His face was pale, his hair slicked back, and his smile was wrong, too wide. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He chuckled, leaning back in his seat. "Just a traveler, like you. Though, I suspect you don't know where you're going." I crossed my arms. "And you do?" "Oh, I know exactly where I'm headed. But you?" He tilted his head, studying me like a puzzle. "You're running from something. Or maybe towards something. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." I didn't respond, turning my gaze back to the window. The scenes outside had slowed, showing a man standing in a rainstorm. He was holding a bouquet of flowers, the rain soaking him to the bone. The sadness in his eyes was so raw it made my chest ache. The man in the suit followed my gaze, his smile fading. "Careful," he said softly. "The train has a way of showing you things you're not ready to see." "What does that mean?" I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he stood, adjusting his suit, and moved to the door at the end of the car. "If you're lucky," he said over his shoulder, "you'll get off before it's too late." And then he was gone, slipping through the door as if he'd never been there. I was alone again. The train began to slow, and I felt a pang of relief. Maybe this was my stop. Maybe I'd step out onto a platform bathed in morning light, and everything would make sense. But when the train came to a halt, the scene outside wasn't a station. It was my apartment. The curtains were drawn, the lights off, but I could see myself inside. Sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, a half-empty glass of wine on the coffee table. The me in the window looked tired, defeated, like someone who had given up trying to outrun the weight of the world. I stood, my legs unsteady, and moved closer to the door. It slid open with a soft whoosh, and the scent of my apartment, familiar and suffocating, wafted in. The train waited. I could step off, walk back into my life, exactly as it had been. No surprises, no mysteries. Safe. But then I heard the hum of the train's engine, felt the pull of its motion, and something inside me resisted. I turned away from the door. The train began to move again, the apartment fading into the distance. As I sat back down, I realized the scenes outside the window had changed. They were brighter now, filled with faces I didn't recognize but wanted to meet. A girl twirling in a field of sunflowers. A man building a boat with his bare hands. A group of friends laughing around a campfire, their joy almost tangible. The train wasn't taking me back. It was taking me forward. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. The first postcard arrived on a rainy Tuesday. It was wedged between a stack of bills and junk mail, the edges soft from handling. The front showed a picture of a lighthouse perched on jagged rocks, waves crashing around it. On the back, written in shaky black ink, were the words, "Wish you were here. M." I didn't know anyone with a name that started with M. At first, I figured it was a mistake. Maybe the postcard was meant for a previous tenant. I'd only lived in the apartment for 3 months, and the mail was still a mess. Catalogs and letters addressed to names I didn't recognize. But the postcard had my name on it. My full name, written with perfect precision. The return address was smudged, illegible. I kept it, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with it. It felt wrong to throw it away, even though I had no clue who sent it. I propped it up on my fridge with a magnet, convincing myself it was just a harmless curiosity. But that night, I dreamed of the lighthouse. In the dream, I was standing on the rocks, staring up at its dark silhouette. The waves were deafening, the spray icy on my skin. The door to the lighthouse was open, swinging gently in the wind. I knew I shouldn't go inside, but my feet moved anyway, dragging me toward the dark spiral staircase within. I woke up before I reached the top. The second postcard arrived a week later. This one showed a dense forest, the trees so thick and close together that barely any light filtered through. On the back, the same handwriting. "The trees are lovely, but they don't speak. I miss you. M." This time, there was no return address at all. I tried brushing it off, but something about the message nagged at me. It felt personal, intimate, even, as if whoever wrote it knew me in a way no stranger should. That night, the dream was different. I was in the forest, walking down a narrow dirt path. The trees were silent, their branches forming a canopy so dense it felt like I was moving through a tunnel. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of earth and decay. I heard footsteps behind me, faint but deliberate, but when I turned, there was no one there. The third postcard arrived 3 days later. This one showed a house. It was old and weathered, sitting in the middle of a desolate plain. The windows were dark, and the front door hung slightly ajar. "The door is open now. Come home, M." That's when I stopped pretending this was random. I asked my friends if they'd been playing a prank, but none of them had. I even called my parents, thinking maybe it was some kind of cryptic family thing, but they were just as confused as I was. The dreams grew worse. Every night, I was pulled back to the places on the postcards: the lighthouse, the forest, the house. Each time, the details became sharper, the sounds louder, the air colder. And each time, I felt closer to something I couldn't name. The fourth postcard didn't arrive by mail. I found it on my kitchen counter one morning, even though I'd locked the doors and windows before going to bed. It was blank on the front, a solid black rectangle. On the back, in the same handwriting, "You're almost there." I threw it away, but that night, it was back on the counter. The dreams became unbearable. The lighthouse wasn't empty anymore. There were figures on the staircase, tall, thin shapes that moved with jerky, unnatural motions. In the forest, I saw faces in the shadows, watching me with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The house was the worst. Every time I approached it, the door creaked wider, and I could hear something inside. Soft whispers, calling my name. I tried staying awake, guzzling coffee and energy drinks, but it didn't matter. Eventually, I'd black out, and the dreams would pull me back. Last night, I didn't wake up. I was standing in front of the house again, staring at the door. This time, the whispers were louder, more insistent. I stepped inside, my body moving on its own, and the door slammed shut behind me. The air was suffocating, heavy with the smell of damp wood and mildew. The inside of the house was wrong. The walls shifted, the floors groaning under my weight. I walked down a long hallway, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence. At the end of the hall was a mirror. When I looked into it, my reflection didn't move. It smiled. Then, it spoke, in a voice that wasn't mine. "You're here." I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, the taste of iron in my mouth. My apartment felt different. The air was colder, the shadows longer. On my nightstand was the fifth postcard. This one showed nothing but a black void. No image, no details, just an endless expanse of darkness. On the back, the message was short. "Welcome home, M." I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know who M is, or why they wanted me to come home. But the air in my apartment feels heavier now, like it did in the dream. And just now, I heard the creak of a door opening. But all the doors in my apartment are already open. I just moved into a new apartment a week earlier, a small but cozy place on the third floor of an old building. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, and that was enough. I hadn't ordered anything, so when I opened my door and found a small brown box sitting on the doormat, I assumed it was a mistake. No label, no return address, just a plain box tied with twine. I probably should have left it alone. Instead, I brought it inside, curiosity getting the better of me. I untied the twine and opened the lid to find a single Polaroid photo lying at the bottom of the box. It was a picture of a door. Not just any door. My door. The shot was close up, taken from just outside, as if the photographer had been standing where I'd found the package. My stomach twisted as I stared at it. Who would have taken this? And why? I stepped into the hallway, looking both ways, but it was empty. The other apartment doors were shut, and I couldn't hear a sound. Just the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "Okay," I muttered, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was a prank. A weird, creepy prank, but nothing more. I decided to forget about it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows made me jump. By the time my alarm went off the next morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. When I opened my door to leave for work, there was another package waiting for me. This one was smaller, no bigger than a shoebox, but tied with the same twine. My hands shook as I picked it up and brought it inside. This time, the box contained a single item, a key. It was old brass, with an ornate bow. The kind of key you'd expect to find in an antique shop or a fairy tale. There was no note, no explanation, just the key resting on a bed of black tissue paper. I thought about throwing it away. Something about it felt wrong, like it was heavier than it should have been, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I placed it on the counter and left for work, glancing over my shoulder the entire way. When I got home that evening, the key was gone. I searched the apartment, every drawer, every surface, but it had vanished. At first, I thought maybe I'd misplaced it, but no, I'd left it on the counter. I was sure of it. Then I noticed something else. The box it had come in, which I'd left on the kitchen table, was now on the floor, its lid askew. Inside was another Polaroid. This one showed my living room. I felt the walls closing in around me, the air thick with the kind of tension that makes your skin crawl. Someone had been inside my apartment while I was gone. I called the landlord, demanding to know if anyone else had access to my unit. He assured me the locks hadn't been changed, and only he and I had keys. "Maybe it's just a prank," he said, sounding unconcerned. "Kids in the building, you know?" I didn't know, and it didn't feel like a prank. That night, I bolted the door, shoved a chair under the knob, and slept with a kitchen knife on the nightstand. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The sound was faint, slow, like someone pacing back and forth across the living room. I stayed perfectly still, clutching the knife, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped. Then, from the darkness, I heard the faint click of a lock turning. I bolted out of bed, flicking on the lights, but the apartment was empty. The door was still bolted, the chair undisturbed. I checked every closet, every corner, but there was no one there. On the counter, where the key had disappeared, was a new box. I didn't want to open it. I wanted to throw it out the window, burn it, anything to get rid of it, but I couldn't ignore it. Inside was another Polaroid. This one showed my bedroom. The shot was taken from the foot of my bed, angled just slightly so you could see me lying there, asleep. I called the police. They came, looked around, asked a few questions, but there was no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. They left, and I felt more alone than ever. For the next few days, nothing happened. No packages, no Polaroids. I started to think it was over. Maybe whoever was doing this had gotten bored. Then, last night, I found the key again. It was sitting on my pillow when I came home, gleaming in the dim light. I stared at it for what felt like hours, dread curling in my stomach. There was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't move. "Hello?" a voice called. It was deep, raspy, and vaguely familiar, like I'd heard it before but couldn't place where. I stayed frozen, gripping the knife in one hand and the key in the other. Another knock. "You left something behind," the voice said. My blood ran cold. I didn't open the door. I didn't sleep. This morning, when I finally mustered the courage to check, the hallway was empty. But taped to my door was another Polaroid. It showed a hand holding the key, reaching for my door. It started with a post-it note on my bathroom mirror. "Don't forget your keys." I didn't think much of it. It was written in my handwriting, after all, and I'm the kind of person who constantly forgets things. It wasn't unusual for me to leave little reminders for myself, but this one was odd because I didn't remember writing it. Still, it was good advice. My keys were sitting on the kitchen counter when I went to leave, and I would have forgotten them otherwise. The next note showed up the following morning. "Take the long way to work." I frowned at that one. The long way? Why? My usual route to the office was quicker and had less traffic. But something about the note gnawed at me, so I did as it said. When I drove past my usual intersection, I saw it. A 3-car pileup, ambulance lights flashing in the early morning gloom. My stomach twisted. If I'd taken my normal route, I might have been caught in it. Or worse. After that, the notes kept coming. Skip the elevator today. The elevator at work broke down that afternoon, trapping 4 people inside. Don't answer the door tonight. I heard knocking at 11 p.m. but stayed on the couch, heart pounding. When I checked the peephole later, no one was there. At first, I was grateful for the notes. They were protecting me, keeping me safe from things I didn't even know to worry about. But then they started getting stranger. Don't eat anything red. Avoid her. Her who? Look in the vent. That last one came on a sticky note plastered to my laptop one morning. My curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed a flashlight to check the air vent in my bedroom. Inside, I found an envelope. It was sealed and unmarked, but when I opened it, I found a photograph of myself, sitting at my desk, typing on my computer. The angle was strange, as if it had been taken from inside the vent. My blood ran cold. I live alone. The next note said, "Lock the bathroom window." I sprinted to the bathroom and found the window slightly ajar. I never opened that window. It sticks too much. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with every light on, clutching a baseball bat and waiting for something, anything, to happen. The notes didn't stop. Leave work early today. I found out later that a fire alarm had gone off in the building, forcing an evacuation. Do not respond to him. My phone buzzed that afternoon with a text from an unknown number. Hey, is this my name? Found your number on an old contact sheet. Let's catch up. I didn't reply. It's in the attic now. That one was the breaking point. I don't have an attic, or so I thought. But when I inspected the ceiling in my hallway, I noticed something I'd never seen before. A faint outline of a square panel, flush with the plaster. I grabbed a chair and pushed it underneath the panel. My hands were shaking as I reached up, pressing on the edges until it popped open. The smell hit me first. Musty, like old wood and mildew. Inside was a narrow crawl space, barely large enough to fit a person. And sitting in the center of it was a box. It was small, made of dark, weathered wood, with no lock or hinges. Just a smooth surface that felt warm to the touch. I brought it down and set it on the kitchen table, staring at it like it might bite me. The next note appeared while I was in the bathroom, splashing water on my face to calm down. It was taped to the mirror when I looked up. Do not open the box. I stared at it, my reflection pale and wide-eyed. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. When I went back to the kitchen, the box was gone. In its place was another note. It knows you found it. That night, I dreamed of the box. I saw it sitting on a table, its surface rippling like water. Something inside it was moving, pressing against the wood, testing its boundaries. When I woke up, there was a note pinned to my pillow. It's watching. I don't know what it is, or why the notes are trying to protect me. But the messages are coming faster now, more urgent. Don't sleep tonight. It's in the hallway. Don't let it touch you. The worst one came this morning. I found it taped to my steering wheel as I climbed into my car. You can't trust the notes anymore. I froze, staring at the words. If I can't trust the notes, then what do I trust? I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. The notes are still appearing, on my computer screen, in my pockets, even on the inside of my fridge door. The latest one is sitting on my desk as I type this. You're out of time. On a Thursday afternoon, as I was shuffling through the monotony of emails and work calls, my doorbell rang. I hadn't ordered anything, but when I opened the door, there was a package sitting on my stoop. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. My name was scrawled on the front in uneven block letters, the kind a child might write. I picked it up, feeling its surprising weight. Inside, I expected to find some mix-up or maybe a prank, but instead, there was only one thing, a wooden box. The box was dark mahogany, smooth to the touch, with a faintly sweet, earthy scent. There were no hinges, no seams, no way to open it, but it was polished to a glassy finish, like it had been handled 1,000 times. I tilted it, shook it gently, and heard nothing. There was no note, no explanation, just the box. I set it on my kitchen counter, stared at it for a few minutes, then went back to work. It was strange, yes, but strange things happen. A wrong address, maybe. Someone's weird art project. It wasn't my problem. But that night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it. A faint humming sound. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, a car engine idling or a far-off appliance. But it wasn't. It was coming from the box. I crept into the kitchen, the hardwood cold under my bare feet. The box sat exactly where I'd left it, dark and inert. But the hum grew louder as I approached. It wasn't a mechanical hum, not exactly. It had a rhythm, like a voice trying to sing but without words. I didn't touch it. I backed away, my pulse quickening, and retreated to my room. By morning, the hum was gone. I told myself I'd imagined it, but part of me didn't believe that. I left the box where it was, ignoring it as best as I could, until 2 days later, when something changed. The wood was warm. I had been avoiding it entirely, but when I reached for my keys on the counter, my hand brushed the box, and it was unmistakable. The smooth, cool surface I'd touched before was now radiating heat. Not burning, but alive, like something inside it was generating warmth. I stared at it, debating whether to call someone. Who, though? The police? What would I even say? Hi, I have a haunted box on my counter. They'd laugh me off the phone. Still, I didn't want to be alone with it. I left the apartment and spent the rest of the day at a coffee shop, trying to distract myself. When I came home that evening, I froze in the doorway. The box was no longer on the counter. It was on the dining table, perfectly centered, like it had been placed there with great care. I hadn't moved it. My hands were trembling as I approached it, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Hello? I called out, half hoping for an answer, but the apartment was silent. I stood over the box, staring at its glossy surface. The faint, earthy smell was stronger now, and the warmth beneath my hand was undeniable. Slowly, against every instinct, I pressed my ear to it. There was something inside. A soft, rhythmic sound. A heartbeat. I stumbled back, my chair clattering to the floor. I don't remember much after that, just grabbing the box, running out the door, and driving until I was far from my apartment. I ended up at a park on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one would notice if you screamed. I set the box on the ground and stared at it, shaking. What do you want? I shouted, my voice cracking. Why are you here? The box didn't answer, but the humming started again, louder this time, rising and falling in waves. The sound made my head throb, made the world feel too bright, too sharp. And then it happened. The box opened. I don't know how. One moment it was solid, seamless wood, and the next it was split down the middle, revealing a dark, yawning void inside. Not a compartment, not a hollow space. A void. Something reached out. It wasn't a hand, or a claw, or anything tangible. It was presence. A vast, consuming presence that spilled from the box like ink in water, seeping into the air, into me. My vision blurred, my ears filled with static, and then there was a voice. Soft, familiar. You called me. I staggered back, gasping for air, but the presence didn't recede. It filled the space around me, coiling like smoke, heavy with something ancient and cold. You opened the door, the voice said, not with malice, but with certainty. I didn't, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The presence surged, pressing against me, inside me, filling every corner of my mind. You didn't have to. The next thing I remember is waking up in my apartment. The box was gone. At first, I thought it was over. A nightmare. A hallucination. But then the whispers started. At night, in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear them. Soft, insistent, always just out of reach. They call my name. They tell me things I don't want to know. The presence hasn't left me. It's with me now, as I write this. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I don't recognize my reflection. And sometimes, when the room is silent, I hear the hum again. It's louder now. A strange, metallic tang that filled the air every night at exactly 3:33 a.m. I know because it woke me up, like clockwork, every night for weeks. At first, I thought it was my radiator. My apartment wasn't exactly top tier, and the plumbing and heating were as old as the building itself. But the smell wasn't like burning metal or rust. It was sharper, colder, almost electric, like the air before a lightning strike. I lived alone on the 6th floor of a 7-story building. My neighbors were friendly enough, but mostly kept to themselves. The apartment directly above mine had been empty for months after the previous tenant moved out, and the one below was occupied by an older man who wore headphones constantly. Nothing about the building felt unusual, at least not until the smell started. The first night I noticed it, I tried to ignore it. I rolled over, buried my face in my pillow, and willed myself back to sleep. But then came the sounds. It started faintly, a soft, irregular tapping. At first, I thought it was pipes. Buildings like this always made weird noises. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate, like someone was knocking on the walls or the floor. I got out of bed and patted around my apartment, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It sounded like it was right above me, in the empty apartment. I stared at the ceiling, half expecting to hear footsteps or the hum of a late-night TV. But there was nothing, just that rhythmic tapping. I called the landlord the next morning. "Probably just the pipes," he said dismissively. "These old buildings do that." "But the smell," I started. "Probably just the vents. I'll send someone to check it out." No one came. And the next night, it happened again. This time, it was worse. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water, and the tapping was louder, almost frantic. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, willing it to stop. Then, at 3:47 a.m., it did. The silence was so sudden it felt unnatural. And that's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like furniture being dragged across a floor. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Stress, lack of sleep. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me. But the third night shattered that illusion. It started the same way. The smell, the tapping. But this time, there was something new. Whispers. Faint, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, straining to make out the words. The voices overlapped, rising and falling like a chant. And then, as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat frozen, clutching my blanket like a lifeline, when a loud, deliberate knock came from my ceiling. 3 knocks, so hard they made the light fixture rattle. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord again, my voice shaking. "You need to check the apartment upstairs," I said. "There's someone up there." "It's empty," he said. "Has been for months." "Then someone broke in," I insisted. "I'm telling you, there's something going on." He promised to send someone to check it out. That morning, I watched from my peephole as the building's maintenance guy unlocked the door to the apartment upstairs. He was inside for less than 2 minutes before he came back out, shaking his head. "Nothing up there," he told the landlord. I knew he was wrong. That night, I decided to find out for myself. At 3 a.m., armed with a flashlight and every ounce of courage I could muster, I crept upstairs. The hallway was eerily quiet, the air thick with that same metallic smell. The door to the apartment was locked, but the maintenance guy hadn't been careful earlier, and I'd noticed him leave the spare key in the utility closet. I slipped the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a space that was eerily similar to my own apartment, but barren and cold. The air was heavier here, oppressive, and my flashlight flickered as I stepped inside. The living room was empty, just bare floors and dusty windows. I moved slowly, my breath loud in the silence. The smell was overwhelming now, making my stomach churn. As I approached the bedroom, the flashlight flickered again and went out completely. I stood there in the dark, paralyzed. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so close it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. I spun around, fumbling with the flashlight, and when it finally clicked back on, I saw it. The floor wasn't empty anymore. Scratched into the wood, stretching from wall to wall, were words. Over and over, in a chaotic, overlapping scrawl. "Let me out." I stumbled back, the beam of my flashlight darting across the room. That's when I noticed the closet door. It was slightly ajar, and something about it made my skin crawl. I don't know why I felt compelled to approach it, but I did. The air around it was ice cold, and the metallic smell was strongest here. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pulled the door open. Inside was darkness, so absolute it felt alive. My flashlight wouldn't penetrate it, the beams swallowed by the void. And then, something moved. I don't know what I saw, only that it was wrong. Twisted, angular, and impossibly fast. It lunged toward me, and I stumbled back, slamming the closet door shut. I ran, down the stairs, back into my apartment, locking the door behind me. The tapping started again that night, louder than ever, accompanied by those whispers. But this time, they weren't just whispers. They were words, clear and deliberate, coming from the ceiling above my bed. "You opened the door. Let me out." I left that apartment the next day, packed what I could fit in my car, and never went back. I don't know what was in that closet, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying awake in my new place, I hear it. The faint sound of tapping, far away but getting closer. Always closer. The first time I saw the reflection, it wasn't mine. It was late, probably past midnight, and I'd just gotten back from work. The day had dragged on forever, and all I wanted was to brush my teeth and collapse into bed. The bathroom was dim, lit only by the weak glow of the overhead bulb, and my reflection looked as tired as I felt. Dark circles under my eyes, hair sticking up in every direction. I didn't even bother fixing it. I was halfway through brushing my teeth when I glanced up at the mirror again and froze. The person staring back at me wasn't me. The face was familiar, but wrong. My reflection smiled, slow and deliberate, but I wasn't smiling. My hands gripped the edge of the sink, but in the mirror, my hands hung loose at my sides. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe the light was playing tricks. Then it moved. Not a flicker, not a twitch. My reflection tilted its head to the side, studying me like I was the one trapped in the glass. My body didn't move an inch, but the reflection's smile grew wider, stretching unnaturally across its face. I turned and ran. By the time I worked up the courage to go back into the bathroom, everything looked normal. My reflection was just that, a reflection. I convinced myself it was a hallucination, stress from too many long shifts and not enough sleep. For a while, I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. The next night, I avoided the bathroom entirely. I brushed my teeth in the kitchen sink, feeling stupid for being so spooked. The rest of the week, I kept all the mirrors in my apartment covered with towels. It felt ridiculous, like I was some kid scared of the boogeyman. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started with small things. Shadows shifting in the corner of my eye, faint whispers just beyond my hearing. My phone would buzz with notifications, but when I checked, there'd be nothing there. I'd catch myself glancing at shiny surfaces, windows, the microwave door, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. Then, 3 days later, I woke up to find the towels pulled off the mirrors. Every single one. My bathroom mirror, the one above the dresser, even the little compact mirror I kept in my bag. They were all uncovered, gleaming in the faint morning light. My stomach sank. That's when I saw the message. It was written on the bathroom mirror in streaks of condensation, like someone had breathed on the glass and traced the words with their finger. "I see you." The writing vanished as soon as I blinked, leaving the glass clean and spotless. I didn't bother going to work that day. I didn't know what I'd tell my boss. "Sorry, I'm being haunted by my own reflection." But I didn't care. I stayed locked in my room, phone in hand, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. Mirrors have always been creepy, sure. Folklore and ghost stories about reflections showing things they shouldn't. Superstitions about covering mirrors after someone dies. But this felt different. Personal. That night, I tried sleeping with all the lights on. I'd smashed the bathroom mirror earlier, satisfying in the moment, but it didn't help. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of faint tapping. It was coming from the mirror above my dresser. I stayed frozen in bed, my heart pounding. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone was trying to knock their way out of the glass. Then it stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to look, the mirror was empty. Just my terrified face staring back. I decided to leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and drove to a motel on the other side of town. I didn't care about the cost. I just needed to get away, to put some distance between me and whatever was happening. The first night was quiet. The second night, I found a handprint on the bathroom mirror. By the third night, I'd stopped looking at my reflection entirely. It didn't matter, though. The tapping followed me. So did the whispers. And the dreams of a dark place, filled with endless mirrors, stretching infinitely in every direction. In the dreams, I could see myself, hundreds of versions of me, trapped behind the glass, staring at me with wide, empty eyes. This morning, I woke up to find a note slipped under my motel door. It was written in my handwriting. "Come back. You can't hide forever." I don't think it's just my reflection anymore. I think it's me. I was walking home late, the streets eerily quiet. The glow of the street lamps created long shadows that seemed to dance and stretch as I moved. My earbuds were dead, leaving me to the ambient sounds of the city, distant sirens, the occasional rustle of wind, the soft hum of power lines. It was the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every flicker of movement. That's when I noticed it, a small, faint blinking light coming from the alleyway to my left. It wasn't the kind of alley you'd expect to find something interesting in, just a narrow strip between two old brick buildings, cluttered with garbage bags and a rusted-out shopping cart. But the light caught my attention. It blinked rhythmically, a pale blue glow that seemed strangely out of place. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the alley to investigate. The light was coming from a device, something half buried beneath a pile of old newspapers. I crouched down and brushed the papers aside, revealing a sleek, black object about the size of a paperback book. Its surface was smooth and cool to the touch, except for a single button in the center that pulsed faintly with the blue light. No logos, no markings, nothing to indicate what it was. I glanced around, half expecting someone to be watching, but the alley was empty. The device felt oddly heavy in my hand, its weight disproportionate to its size. The light blinked faster as I held it, like it was responding to my touch. I should have left it there, walked away, gone home, and forgotten about it. But curiosity won out. I pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. The light faded, and the alley was plunged into darkness again. I exhaled, relieved and a little embarrassed at how tense I'd been. And then the world shifted. It wasn't something I could see or hear. It was something I felt, deep in my bones. The air grew heavy, vibrating with an almost imperceptible hum. The shadows around me seemed to stretch and warp, curling at the edges like smoke caught in a breeze. I stumbled back, dropping the device, but it didn't hit the ground. It hovered, spinning slowly, the blue light now a blinding glow. I turned to leave, but the alley wasn't there anymore. Instead, I was standing in a vast, featureless expanse. The ground beneath my feet was smooth and reflective, like black glass, stretching endlessly in every direction. The sky, or whatever passed for a sky, was a swirling mass of dark clouds shot through with veins of electric blue light. The device floated in front of me, spinning faster now. It pulsed once, twice, and then projected a beam of light that formed into an image, a shape that slowly resolved into a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but as it drew closer, I realized it wasn't quite human. It was tall, impossibly so, its limbs long and angular, its face obscured by a shifting, featureless haze. The only distinct feature was its eyes, two pinpoints of white light that seemed to pierce straight through me. "Why did you press it?" the figure asked. Its voice wasn't a sound. It was a presence, something that echoed directly in my mind. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me. "You weren't supposed to." "I didn't know." I finally managed to stammer. "I didn't." It raised a hand, and I fell silent. The hum in the air grew louder, resonating in my chest. The ground beneath me seemed to ripple, and I realized with a jolt of panic that it wasn't solid. It was liquid, a surface so still it had fooled me into thinking it was stable. "You've opened the door," the figure said. "Now you must choose." "Choose what?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure gestured, and the space around us shifted. Two paths appeared, stretching out into the infinite expanse. One was lined with glowing blue lights, pulsating softly like a heartbeat. The other was dark, its edges jagged and sharp, radiating a faint, menacing energy. Two realities, it said. One you know, one you don't. The device links them. Only one can remain. I stared at the paths, my mind racing. What happens if I choose wrong? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped back, dissolving into the shadows. The device floated in front of me, its light dimming as if waiting for my decision. I didn't understand. None of this made sense. But the weight of the moment was crushing, as though the fate of something much larger than myself was hanging in the balance. My instinct screamed at me to choose the path with the blue lights. It felt safe, familiar. But something about the dark path pulled at me, a strange, magnetic draw that I couldn't ignore. What are these realities? I called out. Why me? The figure's voice echoed faintly, distant and hollow. You pressed the button. I hesitated, my gaze shifting between the two paths. My hand reached out toward the device, trembling as I prepared to make a choice. And then the hum stopped. Everything went still. The paths disappeared, the reflective ground solidified, and I was back in the alley. The device lay at my feet, dark and lifeless, as though it had never been glowing at all. The air was quiet, the streetlights casting their familiar yellow glow. I stood there for a long time, staring at the device. Part of me wanted to pick it up, to press the button again and find out what would happen. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Eventually, I left it there and walked away. The next morning, I woke up to find the device on my nightstand. A single message glowed faintly on its surface. The door is open. Decide. And when I looked outside, the shadows on the street were moving, watching, waiting. I'd bought it at a thrift store on a whim, a heavy antique piece with brass hands and an ornate face that ticked with a satisfying weight. It wasn't something I needed, but it looked like it belonged in a room filled with books and leather armchairs. A life I wasn't living but wanted to. The store owner had barely glanced up when I bought it, muttering something like, "Hope it suits you." It didn't suit me. Not right away. The first night, I hung it on the wall in my living room, directly above the couch. The clock's steady ticking was soothing, like an old heartbeat filling the silence of my apartment. I slept better that night than I had in months, waking up with a strange sense of contentment I couldn't explain. But the clock wasn't set to the right time. It was ahead by 10 minutes. I adjusted it and went about my day, not thinking much of it. The next morning, the clock was ahead by 10 minutes again. I frowned, turning the hands back to the correct time. Maybe the mechanism was faulty? It wasn't a digital clock. I figured the gears could be off. Still, it ticked perfectly, each second a measured, deliberate sound. By the third morning, it was ahead by 20 minutes. I tried not to let it bother me. It was just a clock, after all. But something about it gnawed at me, a vague unease that grew stronger with every adjustment. It wasn't just the time slipping forward. It was the way the clock seemed to know, like it was pushing ahead on purpose. By the end of the week, the clock was ahead by an hour. I decided to take it down. I couldn't explain why, but the thought of that clock ticking away in my living room made my chest feel tight, like the walls were closing in. When I reached up to pull it off the wall, though, the second my fingers touched the brass frame, I froze. The clock stopped. The ticking halted abruptly, the silence deafening in its wake. I stared at it, my heart pounding, waiting for it to start again. It didn't. The hands were still, the brass unnervingly cold against my skin. And then it started moving backward. Not in a smooth rotation, no. The second hand jumped erratically, jerking its way counterclockwise, faster and faster until it was a blur. The hour and minute hands followed, spinning wildly, the ornate carvings on the clock face seeming to twist and ripple in ways they shouldn't. The room dimmed, and for a moment, I thought the power had gone out. But the light wasn't gone. It was wrong. The colors of my apartment seemed faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun. And then I heard it, faint at first, like a distant echo, a voice. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, rising and falling like a plea. It came from inside the clock, low and insistent, as if the brass gears and ticking mechanism were vibrating with sound. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, but the voice grew louder, closer. I left the apartment that night. I couldn't stay, not with that thing sitting in my living room, ticking and spinning like it was alive. I drove to a motel on the other side of town and spent the night staring at the peeling wallpaper, trying to convince myself it was just a malfunctioning antique, nothing more. The next morning, I came home to find the clock exactly where I'd left it. The hands were still spinning backward, but slower now, deliberate. The voice was gone, but the air felt heavier, like the room was holding its breath. I decided to get rid of it. I packed it up, drove to the edge of town, and left it by a dumpster behind an old gas station. As I drove away, I felt a weight lift off my chest, a sense of relief so profound it nearly brought me to tears. That night, I slept peacefully, until the ticking started. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. That steady, deliberate sound, like a heartbeat just out of sync. I turned on every light in my apartment, searching for the source, but there was no clock, no brass hands, no ornate face. Just the ticking, growing louder with every passing second. The next morning, the clock was back. It was sitting on my kitchen counter, perfectly still, as though it had never left. The hands were set to the exact time I'd woken up, and the ticking had stopped entirely. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. But the voice returned. This time, it wasn't faint. It was clear, cutting through the silence of the room like a knife. "Time is wrong," it said, the words dragging out like they were being forced through layers of static. "Fix it." I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the end of the street, my lungs burning, the cold air biting at my skin. But the voice didn't stop. It was inside my head now, echoing with every step I took. "Fix it. Fix it. Fix it. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what it means. But the clock is still there, ticking away in my apartment like it owns the place. And every time I look at it, the hands are moving faster." I wasn't supposed to be on that road. It was one of those aimless nights where you just drive to clear your head. My phone had died, and I'd missed the turnoff to the highway hours ago. Now, I was on some forgotten stretch of rural backroad, flanked by thick trees that loomed like shadows against the headlights. The gas gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty, and I hadn't seen a single car or sign of civilization in miles. Then I saw the house. It appeared so suddenly I almost didn't believe it was real. A grand, sprawling manor set back from the road, its windows aglow with a warm, inviting light. It didn't make sense. A house like that didn't belong out here, surrounded by nothing but darkness and woods. But it was there, and I was desperate. Maybe they had a phone, or at least could point me toward a gas station. I pulled into the gravel driveway, the crunch of the tires sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. The air was cold when I stepped out, and I felt a strange, electric tingle run through me. The house loomed above, its facade strangely pristine, as if it had been plucked from another time and placed here like a dollhouse. I climbed the steps to the front door, hesitating for a moment before knocking. The sound echoed, deep and hollow. A few seconds passed before the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her smile bright but her eyes distant. She looked to be in her late 30s, dressed in a flowing gown that shimmered faintly in the light. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "You must be tired. Please, come in." "I'm so sorry to bother you," I began. "But my car's almost out of gas and I—" "Of course," she interrupted gently, stepping aside to let me in. "You'll stay the night. We insist." Before I could protest, she called over her shoulder, "He's here." Footsteps echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, and a man appeared at the top of a grand staircase. He was tall, handsome in an old Hollywood kind of way, with slicked back hair and a sharp suit that seemed custom-tailored. "Welcome," he said, descending the stairs with an easy grace. "We've been expecting you." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. "You've been expecting me?" I repeated, forcing a laugh. "I think you've got the wrong person. I just got lost and—" "Nonsense," the woman said, her smile widening. "You're exactly where you're meant to be." The man reached the bottom of the stairs, extending a hand. I didn't take it. Come, he said, undeterred. You must be hungry. Dinner is ready. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I was trapped between politeness and unease. Reluctantly, I followed them into a dining room that looked like it had been plucked from a history book. A massive crystal chandelier hung overhead, casting a golden glow over a long table laden with food. It wasn't just any food, it was a feast. Roasted meats, steaming vegetables, freshly baked bread, and desserts piled high with cream and fruit. My stomach growled despite my nerves. Please, the man said, pulling out a chair for me. Sit. I hesitated. This is really generous, but I just need directions or a phone. All in good time, the woman said, her voice soothing. For now, eat. You've had a long journey. I sat, more out of fear than hunger, and they took their seats on either side of me. As I picked at the food, they watched me with unnerving intensity, their own plates untouched. What brings you to our little corner of the world? The man asked, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. I got lost, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. How fortunate, the woman murmured. I glanced around the room, looking for anything that might explain the surreal atmosphere. That's when I noticed the portraits. They lined the walls, dozens of them, all depicting different people. Men, women, even children. Their expressions varied, but their eyes all held the same haunted, hollow look. What's with the paintings? I asked, gesturing with my fork. There are guests, the woman said simply. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Guests? Yes, the man said, smiling faintly. Just like you. I put my fork down, suddenly nauseous. I really should be going. Thank you for the meal, but... You can't leave, the woman said, her voice soft but firm. Excuse me? She stood, her gown shimmering like liquid gold. No one ever leaves. You're part of the house now. I shot to my feet, the chair screeching against the floor. I don't know what kind of game this is, but I'm not staying. The man rose as well, his smile fading. We hoped you'd make this easy, he said, almost regretfully. The chandelier flickered, casting strange shadows across their faces. I bolted for the door, but the house seemed to shift around me. Hallways stretched impossibly long. Doors led to nowhere, and the air grew heavier with every step. Somehow, I found myself back in the dining room. The table was empty now, the food gone. But the portraits, they were different. One of them showed me. My breath caught as I stumbled backward, my eyes locked on the image. It was unmistakable, my face, frozen in a look of terror, staring back at me from the canvas. They're waiting for you, the woman said, her voice echoing. I turned to see her standing with the man, their features shifting, melting into something monstrous. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers, and their smiles stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was my own reflection in their eyes, small, trapped, and screaming. When I woke up, I was in my car, parked on the side of the road. The engine was running, the gas tank full, but in the rearview mirror, I saw the house. Its lights were off now, the windows dark and lifeless, and in the passenger seat was a single painting. It was me, smiling. It began with a letter. A plain white envelope slid under my door while I was brushing my teeth one night. I heard the faint scrape of paper on wood, followed by silence. No knock, no footsteps, no sound of anyone retreating. I walked to the door, toothbrush still in hand, and stared down at it. My name was written in careful, looping cursive across the front, but there was no address, no return label. Just my name. I opened the door, half expecting to catch someone standing there, but the hallway was empty. The air felt still, almost too still, like the building itself was holding its breath. I picked up the envelope, closed the door, and sat down at the kitchen table to open it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly into thirds. The handwriting matched the envelope, elegant and deliberate. You've been chosen. They are watching. Be ready when the time comes. That was it. No explanation. No signature. Nothing. I laughed nervously, set the letter down, and went to bed, trying to convince myself it was a prank. Maybe one of my neighbors was bored. Maybe someone had the wrong apartment. But the words stuck in my head, looping like a bad song I couldn't shake. They are watching. Be ready when the time comes. The next day, the first thing I noticed was the clock. The one on my microwave. I always glanced at it while making coffee. It was part of my routine. But that morning, it was wrong. Completely wrong. Instead of the usual numbers, the display showed 11 hours 11 minutes and 11 seconds. I stared at it for a moment, confused. It wasn't even close to 11:11. My phone said 8:42 a.m. I hit the reset button on the microwave, but nothing happened. It just blinked at me, over and over, the same impossible time. On my way to work, I caught sight of a woman in a yellow coat standing on the corner near my building. She was staring straight at me, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she was trying to figure out what kind of creature I was. I gave her a polite nod and kept walking, but when I turned back a moment later, she was gone. Just gone. No sound of footsteps, no trace of her in any direction. The day passed in a haze. My coworkers felt different, familiar faces, but something was off. They asked me the same questions they always did, but their voices felt too rehearsed, like lines they'd been practicing in a mirror. My boss, who normally avoided small talk, stopped by my desk to ask how I was doing. I told her I was fine, but she lingered, her gaze fixed on me just a moment too long. When I got home, I found another letter waiting. It was identical to the first, the same cursive handwriting, the same lack of a return address. You're close now. The cracks are opening. Don't trust the reflections. That night, I covered every mirror in my apartment. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the other side. I started noticing the cracks the next day. Not literal cracks in walls or floors, but cracks in reality itself. A man walked past me on the subway platform, his coat fluttering unnaturally, like it was caught in a breeze that didn't exist. A car parked outside my building was missing its license plate, but when I looked closer, the plate flickered into view like a glitching hologram. The reflections were the worst. Even with the mirrors covered, I couldn't escape them. Windows, puddles, the screen of my phone, they all showed something wrong. A shadow that didn't belong. A figure standing behind me that wasn't there when I turned around. My own reflection smiling when I wasn't. The letters kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. Don't open the door if they knock. Time is looping. Count your steps. The watchers are testing you. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything that seemed off, but the pages would change when I wasn't looking. My handwriting would shift. New entries would appear that I didn't remember writing. Once, I opened the journal to find a detailed map of a place I'd never been, with a single word scrawled at the top, soon. And then, one night, the knock came. It was soft at first, barely audible. I froze, staring at the door from my spot on the couch. The knock came again, louder this time. Steady, deliberate. I didn't move. My breath hitched as the silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. A voice came from the other side of the door. It was low, calm, and strangely familiar. "Let me in," it said. I shook my head, even though they couldn't see me. The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Let me in. It's time." I stood, my legs trembling, and backed away from the door. The knocking stopped, but the air in the apartment felt charged, buzzing faintly like an exposed wire. And then I heard it, a soft creak, the sound of hinges moving. I turned toward the hallway and froze. There was another door. It wasn't there before. A plain wooden door, standing in the middle of the hallway where nothing should have been. Its knob gleamed faintly, and I swore I could hear whispers coming from the other side. I don't know how long I stared at it. Minutes? Hours? Time felt slippery, unreliable. Eventually, the whispers stopped, replaced by a steady hum. The air seemed to vibrate, pulling me closer, and before I realized what I was doing, my hand was on the knob. The moment I turned it, the world fell away. I was standing somewhere else, a vast, endless void filled with swirling light and shadow. Shapes moved in the distance, too large and strange to comprehend. The air smelled faintly of ozone, and my skin tingled like I was standing too close to an electrical storm. "You came," said a voice behind me. I turned, and there they were, the Watchers. Tall, featureless figures cloaked in shadow, their forms flickering like static. One stepped closer, and though it had no face, I felt its gaze burn through me. "You've been chosen," it said, the same words as the first letter. "For what?" I whispered. "To keep the cracks from spreading." Before I could ask anything else, the void swallowed me whole. I woke up in my apartment, the letters gone, the door vanished. The mirrors were uncovered, but I couldn't bring myself to look at them. The world felt wrong now, like I was walking on the edge of something fragile. The cracks haven't stopped spreading. They're everywhere, in everything. And the Watchers are always near, just out of sight, waiting to see if I'll hold the seams together, or let the world fall apart. The first time I felt it, I was sitting alone in my car at a red light. It was late, too late for anyone else to be out, and the streets were empty. I'd rolled the windows down to let the cool night air in, and everything was quiet except for the faint hum of my engine. Then I felt it, a tug. Not on my body, but deeper, like an invisible thread was wrapped around my mind, gently pulling. My foot hovered over the brake, and for a split second, I thought about pressing the gas. Not consciously. It wasn't me. It was like the thought was placed there, fully formed, foreign and demanding attention. The light turned green, and I shook it off, laughing nervously. Just fatigue, I thought. Too many late nights at work. But the tugs didn't stop. The next one happened while I was brushing my teeth. I was halfway through my nighttime routine when my hand froze mid-motion. A wave of something swept over me, familiar but wrong, like déjà vu turned inside out. My arm lowered the toothbrush on its own, placing it carefully on the counter. Then, without thinking, I walked into the hallway and turned off the light. It wasn't until I was standing in the dark, staring at the closed bathroom door, that I snapped out of it. My heart pounded as I flicked the light back on, the toothbrush still where I'd left it. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale. "Sleep deprivation," I muttered. "That's all this is." Except it wasn't. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to find myself standing in the living room. I had no memory of getting out of bed, no sense of why I was there. The TV was on, blaring static, though I hadn't turned it on in weeks. My hands were cold, and when I looked down, I realized I was clutching the remote so tightly my knuckles were white. I threw the remote onto the couch and bolted back to my room, locking the door behind me. The tugs became more frequent after that. I'd be walking through the grocery store when I'd feel one, sharp and insistent, and suddenly find myself staring at a shelf of canned beans with no idea how I'd gotten there. Or I'd be on my phone, scrolling aimlessly, when my thumb would freeze mid-swipe and hover over a link to an article I didn't recognize. I started keeping a journal, desperate to make sense of it. The entries were chaotic, filled with half-remembered moments and fragmented thoughts. Felt it again today. It's not random. It wants something. Saw a face in the mirror. Not mine. Smiling. It's stronger at night. Do not sleep. The more I wrote, the more I felt like I was losing control. One night, I woke up with my hand pressed flat against the bedroom wall. I don't know how long I'd been standing there, but my palm was warm, and the outline of my hand was faintly visible on the paint. The worst part? I wasn't alone. I didn't see anyone, but I felt them. A presence just behind me, cold and watchful, its breath brushing the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, before whatever it was faded. That's when I realized the truth. The tugs weren't just inside me. They were coming from outside, like a hand gripping a marionette strings. The next morning, I noticed something new. A sticky note, bright yellow, stuck to the bathroom mirror. "Are you ready yet?" I didn't write it. I tore the note down and searched the apartment, checking every door and window. Everything was locked. Nothing was out of place. But when I returned to the bathroom, the note was back. Same message. Same handwriting. By the time I saw the second note, this one taped to the inside of my front door, I knew there was no escaping it. Stop resisting. It's almost time. The tug that followed was the strongest yet. It wasn't gentle this time. It was a yank, and it dragged me into the hallway before I even realized I was moving. My legs weren't mine anymore. They marched forward with mechanical precision, my bare feet slapping against the cold floor. "Stop," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please stop." But it didn't stop. It pulled me to the front door and made me reach for the handle. My fingers gripped the lock, turning it slowly. Then it let go. I collapsed to the floor, gasping, my whole body trembling. The door was still locked, but I could feel it on the other side, waiting. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The tugs are constant now, and the presence feels stronger, closer. Every time I look in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of something behind me, just a flicker, gone before I can focus. I've stopped writing in the journal. It doesn't matter anymore. The sticky notes cover every surface now, their messages growing more insistent. "Open the door. We're waiting. This is what you wanted." I didn't want this. I don't even know what this is. But tonight, as I sit here staring at the front door, I feel the tug again, sharper than ever. My hand is already on the handle. And this time, I'm not sure I can stop myself from opening it. I never meant to find the door. It was hidden at the far end of the alley behind my apartment building, half concealed by a rusted dumpster that hadn't been moved in years. The first time I saw it, I was taking the trash out late at night, my phone flashlight cutting through the gloom. I almost missed it. The door was small, barely big enough for a child to squeeze through, and made of dark wood with a tarnished brass handle. There were no markings, no sign of where it led, and it was set flush against the brick wall, as though it had been there all along, waiting for me to notice. I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your skin prickle, like you're being watched. The air around it was colder, too, sharp and biting despite the warm summer night. I told myself it was just a draft and turned back toward the building. But as I walked away, I thought I heard something faint, a whisper, almost too soft to hear, like someone calling my name. The next day, I told myself it had been a hallucination. I was tired, stressed from work. Maybe I'd imagined it. I even went back to check in the daylight, but the door wasn't there. Just the same blank wall I'd walked past 100 times before. I felt stupid for even looking, but the thought of it stuck with me. That strange, tiny door. The cold air. The whisper. It settled in the back of my mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore. A week later, I saw it again. This time, it was raining, and the alley was slick with puddles reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. I was heading home late, cutting through the alley to save time, when my foot slipped on something. I looked down, cursing, and there it was, the door, exactly where it had been before. The same dark wood, the same brass handle, now slick with rain. It looked impossibly out of place, as though it had been dropped into the world by mistake. I knelt down, running my fingers over the surface. It felt solid, real, but when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. Locked. I leaned closer, squinting in the dim light, and noticed something etched into the wood near the bottom. 3 words, carved deep and precise. "Do not open." I should have walked away then. I should have ignored it, pretended I'd never seen it. But something about those words felt like a challenge. I fished my keys out of my pocket, wedged the edge of one into the gap around the handle, and jiggled it. The lock clicked open with a soft, almost reluctant sound. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing only darkness. The air that seeped out was damp and stale, carrying the faintest hint of something sweet and rotting. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stop, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I leaned in, shining my phone's flashlight into the opening. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow stone staircase spiraling downward. The walls were rough, damp brick, dripping with condensation, and the steps disappeared into shadow. It didn't make sense. There was no basement under the alley, no underground passage I'd ever heard of. But there it was, waiting. I took a step inside. The door swung shut behind me with a soft thud, plunging me into near-total darkness. My flashlight flickered, then steadied, casting long shadows that danced on the damp walls. I should have turned back. I should have left. But something about the place pulled at me, a strange, magnetic curiosity I couldn't explain. The staircase spiraled downward for what felt like forever. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of rot grew stronger, mixing with something metallic. My phone battery ticked lower, and I kept glancing back, half expecting to see the door at the top of the stairs. But the farther I went, the harder it became to tell how far I'd come. The air seemed to thicken, muffling my footsteps, swallowing the sound of my breathing. Finally, I reached the bottom. The staircase ended abruptly, opening into a long, narrow hallway lined with doors. They stretched on endlessly, vanishing into the darkness. Each door was different, some old and cracked, others sleek and modern. Some were made of glass, others of metal or wood, and a few seemed to shimmer, their surfaces shifting like oil on water. I approached the nearest one. A heavy wooden door with a brass knob identical to the one I'd opened at the top of the stairs. My reflection stared back at me from the polished surface of the knob, distorted and faintly wrong. I reached for the handle, but before I could touch it, I heard the whisper again. "Do not open." It was louder this time, clearer, and it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, my flashlight darting across the hallway, but there was no one there. Just me and the endless doors. My hand hovered over the knob, trembling. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the same curiosity that had driven me to open the first door. Maybe it was the pull of the place, the strange, unexplainable allure of the unknown. But I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. At first, I thought it was empty. Then I saw it. A figure crouched in the corner, its back to me. Its limbs were long and thin, bent at impossible angles, and its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones. It didn't move, didn't react to the light or the sound of the door opening. "Hello?" My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. The figure shifted slightly, its head tilting toward me. Slowly, it began to turn. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding. The whispers rose around me, louder now, almost a chant. "Do not open. Do not open. Do not open." I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and fled down the hallway. The doors blurred past me, their surfaces rippling as though alive. The whispers followed, growing louder, sharper, until they filled my head, drowning out everything else. When I finally reached the staircase, I didn't stop. I ran upward, 2 steps at a time, the air growing warmer, the whispers fading with each step. The top of the stairs seemed impossibly far, but when I reached it, the door was there, slightly ajar, light spilling through the crack. I burst through it and into the alley, gasping for air. The door slammed shut behind me, vanishing into the brick wall as though it had never existed. I don't go near the alley anymore. I don't take out the trash at night, don't even look at the spot where the door had been. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers, faint, just at the edge of hearing. And sometimes, when I dream, I'm back in that hallway, surrounded by endless doors, and one of them is open. The night I met the stranger, the city was alive with rain, the streets shimmering under the flickering glow of streetlights. It had been one of those days where everything seemed slightly off. A missed bus, a broken umbrella, a message from an ex that lingered in my mind like an unanswered question. I'd walked aimlessly after work, my feet carrying me through winding alleys and unfamiliar corners, until I found myself outside a bar I'd never seen before. Its sign read, "The Fifth Room," and though I was certain I'd walked this block 100 times, I couldn't recall it ever being there before. Inside, the place was nearly empty, just a bartender polishing glasses and a few patrons lost in their drinks. The air smelled faintly of leather and something sweet I couldn't place, and the low hum of jazz from a record player in the corner filled the room. I slid onto a stool at the bar, shaking off the rain, and ordered a whiskey neat. The bartender, a tall man with sharp features and eyes like dark glass, poured my drink without a word, his movements deliberate, almost hypnotic. It wasn't until my second sip that I noticed the stranger. He was sitting a few stools down, dressed in a black coat that seemed too fine for this kind of place, his face partially obscured by the shadows cast by his wide-brimmed hat. He wasn't looking at me, not directly, but there was an unmistakable weight in the air between us, as though he'd been waiting for me. "You look like someone who's lost," he said, his voice smooth and low, with a cadence that made the words feel like secrets. I laughed dryly, raising my glass. "Isn't everyone?" He tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Perhaps, but not everyone admits it." There was something disarming about him, something that made it easy to talk despite the unease simmering beneath the surface. We spoke for what felt like hours, though the hands of the clock behind the bar never seemed to move. He asked questions that cut straight to the heart of things, what I wanted, what I feared, the moments in my life that I couldn't let go of. And I answered, not fully understanding why I trusted him, but unable to stop myself. Finally, he leaned closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "Would you like a way out?" The question hung in the air, heavy and electric. "A way out of what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everything," he said simply. "The regrets, the monotony, the weight of choices you wish you could take back. I can offer you something better, a chance to rewrite it all." I should have laughed, should have brushed him off as some eccentric trying to mess with my head. But the way he said it, calm, certain, like he'd seen inside me, made the words stick. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box, setting it on the bar between us. The box was unremarkable, its surface worn smooth with age, but when he opened it, the air in the room seemed to shift. Inside was a key. It wasn't like any key I'd ever seen. It was long and thin, made of a silvery metal that seemed to catch the light in impossible ways. Its head was shaped like a labyrinth, intricate and dizzying, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was pulsing faintly, as though alive. "This key opens a door," the stranger said. "A door that leads to the life you were meant to live." The words sent a chill down my spine. "And what's the catch?" His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The catch is simple. Once you walk through, you can't come back. The life you know now will be gone, forgotten, even by you." I stared at the key, my thoughts racing. The idea was absurd, impossible, but a part of me, the part that had been carrying the weight of too many bad decisions and too many missed chances, ached to believe him. "What if I don't take it?" I asked. He shrugged, leaning back in his seat. "Then you'll finish your drink, go back to your life, and nothing will change. But you'll always wonder what could have been." The room felt suddenly smaller, the edges of my vision narrowing until all I could see was the key. I thought about the job I hated, the relationships I'd sabotaged, the version of myself I'd always dreamed of being but never could. And then, without fully understanding why, I reached for the key. The moment my fingers closed around it, the stranger stood, his coat sweeping behind him like a shadow. He tipped his hat, his smile sharp and fleeting. "Good luck," he said, and then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of rain in his wake. The bartender was gone too. The bar was empty now, the jazz replaced by silence, and the only thing that remained was a door at the back of the room that hadn't been there before. It was old and weathered, its frame carved with symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The key in my hand grew warm, almost eager, as though it was waiting for me to act. I stepped toward the door, my heart pounding, and slid the key into the lock. The moment it turned, the air around me seemed to explode, a rush of light and sound that swallowed everything. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in a place I didn't recognize. The city was different, brighter, sharper, like a dream brought to life. My clothes were different too, tailored and elegant, and when I reached into my pocket, I found a business card with my name on it. But it wasn't my name. Not exactly. The title beneath it read Founder, Altair Industries. I looked around, the world unfamiliar but strangely exhilarating. People walked past me with purpose, their faces a blur, and for a moment, I felt a thrill of possibility. This was my life now, a life I'd chosen. But as I wandered through the streets, the thrill began to fade. The people around me didn't greet me, didn't recognize me, and I realized I didn't recognize them either. My memories were a patchwork of half-formed moments, none of them belonging to the person I used to be. The weight of the choice I'd made settled over me, heavy and final. Somewhere, the stranger was watching, and I could almost hear his voice, soft and knowing. "You wanted a way out. And now you have it. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something important behind. Something I couldn't name but desperately wanted to find. And no matter how many doors I opened in this new life, I never found the one that could take me back. It was supposed to be an easy hike. 3 miles up to a scenic overlook, a break for lunch, and 3 miles back down before sunset. I'd done it before, years ago, but this time I was going alone. A solo trip to clear my head, escape the noise of my life for a few hours. Just me, the woods, and a dusty trail winding up into the hills. The day started perfectly. Crisp air, the kind that tastes clean when you breathe it in. I parked at the trailhead around 9 a.m., laced up my boots, and set off. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional bird call or rustle of leaves. My only company was the crunch of my boots on the gravel. About 2 miles in, I saw the first marker, a small wooden sign nailed to a tree with a painted arrow pointing up the trail. 1 mile to overlook, it said. I felt a little surge of accomplishment and kept going, but then I saw it again. Another marker, identical to the first. 1 mile to overlook. I stopped, confused. I hadn't doubled back. The trail was a straight shot with no forks or branches. I looked around, searching for some sign I'd missed, but there was only the path ahead and the forest pressing in on both sides. Maybe they just put up multiple signs, I thought. For encouragement, I shrugged it off and kept walking. That's when I heard the footsteps. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A rhythmic crunching on the gravel trail behind me. I turned, expecting to see another hiker, but the path was empty. The forest was silent again, except for the faint whisper of the wind through the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice oddly small in the vastness of the woods. No reply. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the footsteps didn't return. Shaking off the unease creeping up my spine, I turned back toward the trail and kept walking. The trees felt taller now, the shadows longer, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Then I saw the marker again. 1 mile to overlook. This time, I froze. The sign wasn't just identical, it was the same. The paint was faded in the exact same spots, the nail holding it to the tree slightly rusted. My heart thudded in my chest as I scanned the area around me. Had I somehow looped back without realizing it? Was I going in circles? I pulled out my phone, hoping to check my GPS, but of course, there was no signal. The screen just showed an empty map with a spinning wheel. I cursed under my breath and stuffed it back in my pocket. Keep moving, I told myself. Just keep moving. You'll hit the overlook eventually. I pressed on, trying to shake the gnawing feeling that I was being watched. The forest seemed quieter now, like the birds had stopped singing. Even the wind had stilled. The footsteps came back, closer this time. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The trail behind me was empty, but the sound was unmistakable, crunching steadily on the gravel. "Who's there?" I shouted. No answer. I grabbed a rock from the side of the trail, my fingers trembling. I wasn't about to let some creep sneak up on me out here. But as I stood there, gripping the rock, the footsteps stopped again, leaving me alone with the oppressive silence. When I turned back to the trail, my stomach dropped. The marker was gone. Not just the marker. The tree it had been nailed to. The surrounding landmarks, all of it. The trail ahead stretched on into unfamiliar woods, the terrain steeper, rockier. It didn't make sense. I hadn't left the path. I hadn't turned or wandered off. But somehow, everything had changed. I kept walking, though my legs felt heavier with every step. The trees looked different now, their trunks gnarled and blackened like they'd been burned. The air smelled faintly of smoke and something metallic, like blood. The trail beneath my feet was no longer gravel but loose, dry earth that crumbled with every step. I passed another sign. This one wasn't like the others. It was crude, handwritten in jagged black letters on a piece of rotting wood. "Turn back." I stopped, staring at the sign, my heart pounding. It wasn't a warning. It felt like a command, a desperate plea from someone who'd been here before me. But the thought of turning back terrified me even more. What if I passed those same markers again? What if the footsteps followed me? I pushed forward, the unease now a full-blown panic clawing at my throat. The trail eventually ended at a clearing. For a brief moment, relief washed over me. This had to be the overlook. I'd made it, but the sight before me wiped that relief away in an instant. The clearing wasn't empty. It was filled with people, or something pretending to be people. They stood perfectly still, facing away from me, their backs rigid, their heads tilted slightly downward. Their clothes were dirty and torn, and their skin was pale, almost gray. I stepped closer, my breaths shallow and quick. The figures didn't move, didn't react. It was like they hadn't noticed me at all. And then one of them turned around. It wasn't a person, not anymore. Its face was stretched, the features distorted like melted wax. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to suck in the dim light around them. It tilted its head, as if studying me, and then its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide smile. Behind it, the others began to turn, one by one, their faces just as warped, their smiles just as wrong. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, the rock falling from my hand. The figures started moving toward me, slowly at first, then faster, their movements jerky and unnatural. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop, even as the trees seemed to close in around me, their blackened branches clawing at my arms. The footsteps were deafening now, pounding behind me, closing the distance. When I burst out of the woods, the sun was setting, casting a blood-red glow over the parking lot. My car was there, just as I'd left it, but the trailhead sign was gone. I didn't stop to think. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and tore out of there, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I haven't told anyone what happened. How do you explain something like that? But every night since, I've dreamed of the clearing, of the figures with their melted faces and hollow eyes. And in the distance, I can always hear the crunch of footsteps coming closer. I wasn't supposed to be there. It was a warehouse, the kind that looks abandoned but isn't really. A friend of a friend told me about it, some local urban legend. They said it was a place you only went to on a dare, a sprawling maze of rusted beams, broken windows, and forgotten machinery. Supposedly, people who went inside came back different. Some didn't come back at all. I didn't believe in that kind of thing. Ghost stories, creepy places, it's all just atmosphere, right? But that night, I was bored, restless, and maybe a little drunk. So, when my friend Tyler suggested we check it out, I shrugged and said, why not? We arrived just after midnight. The warehouse loomed against the sky, a jagged silhouette that seemed to swallow the moonlight. The air around it was unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. The gate was chained shut, but someone had cut the links. Fresh cuts. Tyler grinned, swinging the gate open with a creak that echoed too loudly in the empty lot. You coming? He asked, already stepping through. I hesitated. There was something about the place that felt wrong, like it was watching us. But I followed. Inside, the air was colder, heavier, carrying the faint smell of oil and rust. Our flashlights barely pierced the darkness, illuminating fragments of the space. A broken conveyor belt, a pile of decaying pallets, a wall covered in graffiti. We walked in silence, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by the cavernous space. After a while, I started to notice things. Small things. Like how our flashlight beams didn't seem to stretch as far as they should have, or how the shadows on the walls seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Creepy, huh? Tyler said, his voice too loud. Yeah, I muttered, trying not to sound unnerved. We reached the center of the warehouse, where a massive piece of machinery loomed in the dark. It looked like it had been part of some kind of assembly line, but now it was just a skeletal frame, its gears and wires exposed like broken ribs. This is it, Tyler said, his voice tinged with excitement. This is where they say it happens. Where what happens? I asked, my unease growing. He smirked. The disappearances. The weird stuff. You know, the stories. I rolled my eyes. You drag me out here for urban legend crap? But Tyler wasn't listening. He was shining his flashlight on the machine, his eyes wide with curiosity. Come check this out, he said. I didn't want to, but I stepped closer. The The machine was covered in grime, its surfaces etched with strange symbols that didn't look like they belonged. Some were carved deep into the metal, others painted in a substance that glimmered faintly in the light. "Looks like someone got creative," I said, but my voice sounded hollow. Tyler didn't respond. He was staring at something on the floor, a hatch. It was small, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, and made of thick, rusted steel. A faint draft seeped through the edges, carrying a metallic tang. "Let's open it," Tyler said, dropping to his knees. "Are you kidding me?" I said. "This place is bad enough. I'm not crawling into some underground death trap." But Tyler was already working on the hatch, prying at it with a crowbar he'd pulled from his backpack. The metal groaned, resisting, but eventually gave way with a loud clang that echoed through the warehouse. A cold gust of air rushed out, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Tyler, don't," I said, my voice shaky. But he didn't listen. He swung the hatch open and aimed his flashlight down. I peered over his shoulder, and what I saw made my stomach lurch. The space beneath wasn't a basement or a crawl space. It was a tunnel, stretching down into the earth at an unnatural angle. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and lined with more of those strange symbols. A faint, pulsing light came from somewhere deep within, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. "Holy crap," Tyler whispered. "We have to check it out." "No," I said firmly. "We don't. We really don't." But Tyler was already climbing in. "Tyler," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "This is insane. Let's just go." "Come on," he said, shaking me off. "Don't you want to know what's down there?" "No," I said again, but he was gone, his flashlight beam bouncing as he descended into the tunnel. I stood there for a long moment, torn between leaving and following. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. But another part, the part that didn't want to abandon my friend, won out. Cursing under my breath, I climbed in after him. The air in the tunnel was stifling, thick with the smell of metal and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. The light at the end pulsed steadily, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The further we went, the more the symbols seemed to shift, like they were crawling across the surface. "Tyler," I called, my voice echoing unnaturally. No answer. The tunnel grew narrower, forcing me to crouch as I moved. The pulsing light grew brighter, almost blinding, and the walls seemed to hum, vibrating faintly under my hands. And then I heard it, a sound that froze me in place. It was a low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. "Tyler?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Still no answer. I pressed on, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The light ahead flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw a shadow move across it. Something huge. Something wrong. I reached the end of the tunnel and found Tyler's flashlight lying on the ground, its beam pointing into the corner. The air was suffocating now, heavy with that sweet, rotting smell. And then I saw it. In the corner, something was crouched, its body twisted and unnatural. It turned slowly, its face, or what was left of it, lit by the pulsing light. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could understand. I ran. I don't remember climbing out of the tunnel or getting back to the car. All I remember is the sound of it behind me, that dragging noise, getting louder and louder until I slammed the door and peeled out of the lot. Tyler never came back. I told the police, but they didn't find anything. No tunnel, no symbols, no pulsing light. Just an empty warehouse, abandoned and quiet. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the growl, and I know it's not over. I never wanted to take the job. Being a house sitter was never part of the plan. But bills pile up fast when you're between jobs, and desperate times call for desperate measures. When Mrs. Calder called me out of the blue, offering a week's worth of cash to watch over her sprawling countryside estate, I couldn't afford to say no. The house was enormous, the kind of place you'd see in a period drama. Ivy-covered stone walls, towering windows, and creaky wooden floors. She'd walked me through the basics before leaving, a tour of the rooms, instructions for feeding her ancient cat, Edgar, and a few rules. "Don't go into the cellar," she'd said. her voice unusually stern. "There's nothing down there you need to worry about." That should have been my first clue. The first few nights were uneventful. The house was drafty and quiet, save for the occasional creak of old wood and the soft patter of Edgar's paws on the floor. I spent most of my time in the library, flipping through dusty old books and sipping tea from Mrs. Calder's absurdly fancy china. But on the fourth night, I heard it. I was in bed, half asleep, when a sound pulled me back to consciousness. At first, I thought it was the wind. It had been howling all night, rattling the windows. But then I heard it again. A low, rhythmic scraping, like metal dragging against stone. It was coming from beneath the floor. I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound wasn't loud, but it was persistent, steady. Edgar, who had been curled up at the foot of the bed, suddenly stood and hissed, his fur bristling. "Probably just the pipes," I muttered, trying to calm myself as much as the cat. But Edgar bolted out of the room, his tail puffed up like a bottle brush. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, stepping cautiously into the hallway. The scraping continued, faint but distinct, leading me toward the cellar door at the end of the corridor. I should have stopped. I should have turned around and gone back to bed. But something about the sound drew me forward, a gnawing curiosity I couldn't shake. The cellar door was locked, of course, just as Mrs. Calder had promised. But as I stood there, staring at it, I noticed something strange. A faint glow seeping through the crack beneath the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Is someone down there?" No answer. Just the scraping, growing louder now, more frantic. I fumbled for the keyring Mrs. Calder had left on the kitchen counter and found the small, tarnished key she'd pointed out as for emergencies only. My hand shook as I slid it into the lock, the mechanism clicking with a sharp metallic snap. The air that rushed out as I opened the door was cold and damp, smelling of earth and decay. My flashlight illuminated a narrow staircase, the stone steps slick with moisture. The glow I'd seen from the hallway was brighter now, pulsing faintly from somewhere deep below. "Edgar?" I called, half hoping the cat had somehow caused all this. But the scraping had stopped. Against my better judgment, I descended the stairs, one slow step at a time. The glow grew stronger as I went, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The staircase ended in a cavernous room, its walls lined with shelves of old jars and tools that looked like they belonged in a Victorian asylum. In the center of the room stood a metal cage, its bars thick and rusted. Inside was something. At first, I couldn't make sense of it. The thing crouched in the cage was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and stretched taut over bones that jutted at odd angles. It had no eyes, just smooth, blank sockets where they should have been. It turned its head toward me, its lips curling into a grotesque smile. "Ah," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves. "You're not her." I staggered back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. What the hell are you?" The thing chuckled, a sound that sent ice down my spine. "She didn't tell you, did she? Smart woman. Keeps her secrets well." I wanted to run, to bolt up the stairs and never look back, but my legs wouldn't move. I'm calling the police," I stammered, fumbling with my phone. "Oh, do," it said, leaning against the bars. "But they won't find me. They never do." The light in the room flickered, and for a moment, the creature disappeared, replaced by an empty cage. But when the glow returned, it was there again, grinning wider. "Leave," it whispered, its tone suddenly sharp. "Go now, before she comes back." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the cellar door behind me and locking it with trembling hands. Edgar was nowhere to be found, and I wasn't about to stick around to look for him. I grabbed my bag, ran to my car, and drove straight home, ignoring the calls that started coming from Mrs. Calder's number the moment I left. She left me a voicemail the next day, her voice calm and measured. "You opened the door, didn't you? I warned you not to. Don't come back." I blocked her number, but sometimes I still see her name pop up on my phone late at night, always accompanied by that same cold, rhythmic scraping in the distance. I'd been furnishing my new apartment on a tight budget, so thrift stores and flea markets were my go-to. The mirror caught my eye immediately, tall, ornate, with a gold frame covered in intricate carvings of twisting vines and tiny flowers. It had that antique charm that made it look way more expensive than the $25 price tag hanging from the corner. "Good eye," the shop owner said as I handed over the cash. She was an older woman with a voice like dry leaves rustling. "This one's got a lot of history." "What kind of history?" I asked, curious. She shrugged, her expression unreadable. "Just make sure you don't put it in your bedroom." That should have been my first clue to leave it behind, but I laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to add some mystique to a piece of old furniture. I loaded the mirror into my car and drove home. At first, it was perfect. I propped it up against the wall in my living room, where the sunlight caught the gold frame and made the carving seem to glow. It gave the whole space a kind of vintage elegance, and I found myself admiring it every time I walked by. But then, little things started happening. The first time I noticed it, I was watching TV. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the mirror. Just a flicker, like someone walking past behind me. I turned around, expecting to see a reflection of my neighbor through the window, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I told myself it was a trick of the light and went back to my show. But over the next few days, it kept happening. Quick flashes of movement that disappeared the second I turned my head. A shadow darting across the glass. The vague impression of a figure standing just out of view. Then came the sounds. At first, it was faint, a soft tapping, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the mirror's surface. It always happened late at night, when the apartment was silent, and it always stopped as soon as I approached the mirror. I pressed my ear to the glass once, half expecting to hear something, but there was nothing, just the cold, smooth surface against my skin. I started to feel uneasy around the mirror, but I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't until last Thursday that I realized how wrong. I'd just gotten out of the shower, and the apartment was filled with steam from the bathroom. As I walked into the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. The mirror's surface was fogged up, like it had been breathing. And written in the condensation, in uneven, jagged letters, was a single word. "Look." My heart started pounding. I wiped the glass clean with my hand, but the word didn't disappear. It was etched into the mirror itself, faint but unmistakable. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, and for the first time, I felt genuinely afraid. That night, I moved the mirror into the hallway closet and shut the door. I didn't sleep. Every creak of the apartment felt louder than usual. Every shadow seemed longer. At one point, I thought I heard the tapping again, muffled this time, like it was coming from behind the closet door. By the next morning, I was done. I grabbed a blanket to cover the mirror and hauled it out to the curb, determined to leave it behind for the garbage truck. As I drove to work, I felt a wave of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my chest. But when I got home that evening, it was back. The mirror was leaning against the living room wall, exactly where I'd first placed it. The blanket was folded neatly at its base. I don't remember unlocking the front door. I don't remember letting anyone in, but there it was, gleaming in the fading light, and I knew then that I couldn't escape it. That night, the dream started. In the dream, I was standing in front of the mirror, but the reflection wasn't mine. It was something else. It looked like me, but its face was wrong. Its eyes were too wide. Its mouth stretched into a smile that didn't belong on a human face. It beckoned to me, motioning for me to step closer, and when I didn't move, its hands pressed against the glass. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. When I went into the living room the next morning, the mirror was shattered. The gold frame was intact, but the glass was broken into a spiderweb of cracks, the center completely caved in. For a brief moment, I felt relief. Whatever had been haunting me was gone. But then I noticed the shards on the floor. They weren't reflecting the room. Instead, they showed something else. A dark, endless expanse, like a void stretching out forever. And in the largest shard, just visible in the corner, I saw a figure standing far away, growing closer. I didn't stay to watch. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and Maisie, and I left. That was 2 days ago. I've been staying at a friend's place, trying to convince myself it's over. But last night, I woke up to a sound I can't explain. A soft tapping, coming from the other side of the bedroom mirror.